It's 11 o'clock, so whenever you're ready, Brianna.
Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. So hi everybody, my name is Brianna Brown. Looking at the list, I think I've had classes with some of you, so it's good to see you again. My advisor on this project is Adrienne Goldsberry, so I would just like to give her a shout out and say thank you for all of the help that she has given me in the past semester here. So my topic is the spatial distribution of French dialects and the physical environment. And before I dive into it, I kind of want to talk about how I got to this topic and why I think it's important for a geographer to look into something. So I'm certainly more of a human geographer, and I really like to apply GIS and spatial technology to human geography. So that's kind of what got me started with looking at the intersection of geography and linguistics. So here, you could see a typical map, land cover of France. That's typically what geographers would be interested in, whereas linguistics, this chart on the side, which as a non-linguist doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, but I'll be honest. This is typically what each field looks at in their own right. So I thought this was sort of odd because language, like most things, has a spatial component. Certain places have certain distributions of language, and a lot of times the physical environment or even just where things are located does dictate where certain languages are spoken. So that's what got me started thinking about this problem and why it's not as looked into as other things that we typically see, such as maybe more environmental concerns or even other aspects of socioeconomics, like wealth or education, things like that, that I know we've all had an opportunity to map in the past. So as I looked into this and started forming what my project was going to be, I learned that there are a lot of challenges when it comes to mapping language. So this image here, you can see there's what they call an isogloss map. And this is typically, even back in the days when people were hand drawing maps and didn't have the tools that we have today, this is typically how languages and dialects were represented. So very hard boundaries. You could probably imagine this isn't the most realistic approach because you're drawing a very stark boundary as to where one language is spoken and not spoken, and that's not the case. So I mean, you could just imagine if you live on one side of this line, you might speak what people are speaking on the other side, and it's just really difficult, especially with how fluid people are and how fluid language is, to really get an accurate depiction. So that is one reason why these fields have sort of operated separately. They're just really tough to bring together. There's truly no right answer into how to map languages perfectly. There's no way to do that because you'd have to record exactly what everybody says everywhere in the world. So getting more technical though, of course, this is more of a vector symbology, which does make those unrealistic linguistic boundaries. And it's always some sort of aggregation. Like I said, there's actually no way to really know what every single person is speaking and be able to map that in a way that it's perfect. So it is something you sort of just have to accept, but this got me thinking, what's the best way to aggregate to get as realistic as possible? And another factor in the challenges that cartography of language presents is scale. So of course, if you're really zoomed out, you're going to see just more like macro languages. Maybe that's a language family like Indo-European, or maybe you're zooming in a little more than that and you're looking at Romance language. Whereas if you zoomed into a specific place, you could see more dialect or even like accent mapping. So scale is another thing that it really needs to be taken into consideration. And going back to what I was talking about before, where geography and linguistics are typically two different fields practiced by different people. This has a lot to do with it because these are very technical considerations that a linguist may or may not have the training in. And vice versa, a lot of the linguistic research that would need to be done to get the aggregation as correct as possible or as accurate as possible isn't necessarily in the wheelhouse of your typical geographer. So it's just sort of a place where there's not a ton of overlap in skill sets, and that's why there's a lot of opportunity to look into this. That's not to say that it hasn't been done. This map here, I feel like people are probably somewhat familiar with. So a few years ago in the New York Times, this quiz was published called Speaking American, and you could select from multiple choice what you typically say. The map here shows what you call a carbonated beverage, so soda, pop, or Coke. And it would pinpoint where it thought you were from in the US based on the way you speak or what you call things. So, I mean, it is done. It's just a complex topic. Now, comparing this map to that last one I showed with the isoglosses, you'll see very obviously this is a raster map. So something I did uncover was that a raster display does lend more accuracy to your visualization. So it's probably the more appropriate cartographic representation. And new technology and new developments in how to create you know, the raster or the just whatever method you're using to get that vector data into raster is going to help you with the accuracy of your representation given what your data is. Of course, different data will have different methods for best ways to visualize it. Aggregation still exists and should be accounted for. I'm originally from the Rochester, New York area, so if I were taking this quiz, I would say pop for one of these beverages, but you could see the Rochester area is kind of like right on that line there of soda or pop, so it's kind of a personalized way to see how it's not always easy or I guess black and white as to where you fall in a language mapping scenario. And again, scale is important. I'm sure if you zoomed in on some of these places throughout the US, there would be pockets of different you know, representation for these different words. So it has been done. It is something that's sort of up and coming, but it's not your typical geographic analysis. So now that I was starting to form my idea a little bit more, knowing that I wanted to figure out how to map a language as accurately as possible, I stumbled upon the field of dialectology. So this looks more at specifically within a language where certain dialects are located in relation to one another. So that map of the US we were just looking at, that's a good example, I guess. You could sort of see where different dialects are clustered based on that particular example. The actual definition for where a dialect boundary occurs is when those isoglosses bunch up. So where there's a lot of similarities in certain things that people are saying and where that spatial distribution occurs. So this got me thinking that I wanted to really narrow down my project to one particular language and figure out where certain dialects occurred and why, and how we could best represent those on a map. And I found that typically in this space, the best way to go about it is to go through, I guess, a series of 3 maps to get to your final output. First would be mapping those lexical or like very in-depth linguistic data points. So if you go back to my first slide where there was that complicated chart of phonetic spellings of different things, that like a lexical variation map would be mapping where those specific pronunciations occur, and that's most likely a point feature if you're thinking about maybe you're surveying people or even aggregating a city and you just have it as a point representing that city, typically a point layer. Then from there, you use that data to create an isogloss map. So trying to aggregate those different points into some sort of boundary. And then after that, it becomes a bit easier to visualize where exactly those boundaries occur. It's kind of hard when you're looking at this chart to see what I mean, but the same study that produced that chart gave these maps as examples. So here you could see on the left, again, there's lots of point data that you can sort of see the patterns emerge, but until you create isoglosses and then finally the official boundaries, you don't really have a delineated approach for visualizing that. So after that, I started looking at what they call variationist linguistics. So differences within a language, so dialects that are used by people of different classes or occupations, different sociolinguistic reasons. But at first I was going to go into maybe trying to find how a raster data set aggregated from some vector data could indicate different socioeconomic patterns. And then I found that there's actually been a lot of research into how the environment is related to linguistics. So a few studies have shown that things such as latitude or temperature, precipitation, they could all affect where languages or dialects are distributed across the globe and how they vary in the environment. So that's really what made me decide that I wanted to narrow down the French language, looking at different dialects and where they occur in relation to different environmental factors. So getting to what my project is actually about after all of that background, I want to essentially figure out if there is any correlation or just better understand the relationship between these two maps here. I mean, not specifically these two, but the data that you would use to create maps like this. So again, on the left, you have more environmental land cover. On the right, a raster distribution of different dialects of French. So is there any reason environmentally why these dialects occur where they do? To do that, I want to map the physical environment of France. Specifically, I want to look at water bodies and elevation because those have generally served as natural barriers to where maybe people live or lived in the past, maybe how people commute or migrate throughout a certain area. So that could impact why a certain language has appeared in one place and not in another. Maybe there's a river or something that has been hard to cross, so people don't exchange their language as much, and as such there would be a pretty big distinction between the two dialects. Elevation, same thing. Maybe if there's a really mountainous region, they have their own dialect because they're more isolated. I just want to understand this better, and in doing so, map the dialect boundaries of France and figure out what the relationship is. The three patterns I know I want to look at right now, I might end up finding more than I want to look at, but for now, this is what I'm trying to focus on. Like I said, do dialect boundaries correspond to physical boundaries? What's the relationship between elevation and dialects? And then also kind of going off those studies that I looked at as my inspiration, what's the relationship between latitude and longitude and dialects? Because it's not something that I would have thought of on my own actually, but there have been a lot of studies that have shown certain languages, there's more higher density of dialects in certain latitudes or certain longitudes. There's a relationship there. So I do want to look at that since France is a pretty large country. I mean, not as large as some others, but it's a decent size. So there might be some distribution related to coordinates. And to do that, I have reached out to a group of French researchers who have digitized some data that was collected back in the early 1900s. Back then, the two researchers went around France and took a survey of how people spoke, and they created the Atlas Linguistique de la France, and they created those typical static isogloss maps. And they drew them, and they are in a bunch of different volumes of books. But and a few years ago, a group of researchers digitized that. And so I'm going to take that data as my language or dialect data. And then for environmental data, I've been identifying a few different sources, mainly government or open source data sets that have you know, elevation or rivers, the environmental boundary data that I was talking about. So it's going to be a combination of this data from the research group and some open source environmental data. I am still considering which exact methods I want to use. A lot of it is going to go back to looking at the different types of methods other researchers have used when they've tried to depict these different patterns for different languages. The group that I am getting the data from, they have it in vector format, but they have also experimented with different raster visualizations. So I'm going to also look at that and see what is going to fit the purpose of this study more. But I am still working on getting the data from them. So I feel like until I have it, I can't make a concrete decision. But these are some of the things that I'm looking at. So maybe some R methodology, or an overlay analysis, or just some typical raster manipulation might be the way to go. Again, I'll decide once I speak with the researchers more and look at the data and read and reread and over again the study that they did. My expected results are going to be some sort of relationship between the dialect boundaries and physical boundaries, and just general patterns of dialect density across France. So my timeline for this project, I have been working for the past couple months on everything I just spoke about, the topic, initial research. And in January, I plan to start my technical analysis. That way in February and March, I can start writing up my final paper, creating a poster. I am planning on submitting a proposal for a poster at AAG in April in Denver. So that's my top choice, I think, for my presentation aspect, but there are a few other things that I'm considering. I'm located right now in New York City, so there are a lot of opportunities to present maybe at a cultural institution or a library, something like that. And that is my backup if AAG doesn't work out. But my goal is to have this final project submitted in May, so that I can graduate and everything will be on time. So I know I just ran through a ton of information, but I would love to know if there are any questions and just hear what everybody has to say about my project proposal. Thank you. So I don't see any questions yet. I do apologize if I'm missing something, but I don't think I see any.
Sorry, Brianna, my mic was muted. I have a question.
Oh, that's okay. Sure.
Have you thought, I know you're strictly thinking of like physical boundaries.
Mm-hmm.
Have you considered using like if that's like a stipulation for you? I was going to ask like how much is like globalization or like the increased opportunity to like for people to move around the world? Like how much do you think like at a local level that's going to affect like your interpolation of like the dialects? Or I guess like have you thought about using like physical boundaries? Like it's Europe, so I'm thinking like past kingdoms or past like political boundaries that may have segregated people, if that correlates at all.
Yeah, it's something that I really played with for a while. Like I said, my interests tend to lie more in the human geography realm, which would align more with that. And I really was thinking about doing the same sort of study, but finding relationships, like you said, between maybe former political boundaries or even migration routes or transportation routes, because there is such fluidity with that, especially in Europe, with other countries being in such close proximity. But I do think that just given the scope of the project, I wanted to focus on something a little more well-defined and just smaller, so that I can make sure I do it the best way possible. So I think that's why I chose the physical environment. I figured that was extremely well-defined, as opposed to figuring out what constitutes a kingdom. Was this a disputed kingdom? When did this road come into effect? I figure if a mountain has been there, it's been there long enough to make an impact. But it's certainly something I would like to look into in the future, or I hope somebody else does, because I would be very interested in reading such a study.
Cool.
Great. Okay, is there any other questions?
I don't think so. Everyone's very quiet today. So
Okay.
I think that's it. But I think that's really interesting. I find, you know, the language and partitioning of language and how it evolves and varies from place to place is fascinating. We've seen it with French in Quebec and how that has, you know, some of the word usage there is very different to what is used currently in France and stuff. So I look forward to learning more about what you find.
Yeah, absolutely. That's something I thought of too, was French is obviously a language that had a big impact with colonialization. So I thought about that aspect, and that will probably be a point that I make in my conclusion. You know, for future studies, somebody might want to look at areas that were impacted by French due to colonialization. And I think, yeah, like you said, it's just a really interesting field. So I'm looking forward to learning what I do and sharing it with everybody. So thanks all.
Great.
All right, I'm going to stop sharing and turn
Okay.
it over.
So our next presenter, don't forget to fill in the feedback. I've just reposted the peer evaluation form. So Zan, if you can get your presentation loaded, that'd be great.
Certainly, let me know when it appears for you.
Yeah, I see it.
Great, and do we need to wait until 11:30 or can we just go ahead and get started?
I think go ahead and get started. It always works out eventually.
Okay, wonderful, that sounds great.
Go for it.
Fantastic, well thank you Justine, thank you Beth King also for hosting this. Hello everyone, my name is Zan Fredericks and my capstone project proposal is to detect volumetric change for Puerto Rico using LiDAR data acquired both pre and post Hurricane Maria. My advisor is Karen Schuckman, who's provided guidance on the topic of LiDAR-derived analyses since my first course with her last year. And I do want you to note that all graphics and referenced works are reproduced for educational use only. Similar to Brianna, I want you guys to better understand why I feel this project is important, not just to the community at large, but also to me. So I wanted to provide a bit of my professional background. I work at the U.S. Geological Survey and serve as the Associate National Map Liaison to Florida, Puerto Rico, and the U.S. Virgin Islands for the USGS National Geospatial Program. This is the program that provides the digital geospatial foundation for the United States, and it's responsible for designing and planning and really executing the National Topographic Mapping Program. I also serve as the LiDAR coordinator for the USGS Coastal and Marine Hazards and Resources Program. And I'm based in St. Petersburg, Florida at the St. Petersburg Coastal and Marine Science Center. And for both of these programs that I work for within the USGS, a large focus of mine is to serve Puerto Rico in the geospatial realm. Now, additionally, I'm an active member in both the American Society for Photogrammetry and Remote Sensing, or ASPRS, as well as the Urban and Regional Information Systems Association, which is better known as URISA. And this involvement is important to this project because the LiDAR data I'll talk about follows both the ASPRS positional accuracy standards for digital geospatial data as well as the last common data exchange format activity. And Jerissa is the founding member of the GIS Certification Institute, which administers the GIS professional certification. And as a certified GISP, I adhere to a GIS code of ethics that states that I have an obligation to society and to others to make contributions to the community and the discipline, among some other stipulations. And I really believe that this project will be a meaningful contribution. So for a little background to help you better understand the project and the data that I'll be using, the USGS has this long history of providing elevation data. First, we did it through the national map contours, later by digital data in the National Elevation Data Set, and now it's through the 3D elevation program. So my work for the USGS National Geospatial Program largely focuses on 3DEP, and the impetus for the program was really the National Enhanced Elevation Assessment, or NEA, and it was a needs and benefits study of federal, state, local, tribal, private entities that focused on high-resolution elevation data. It was conducted back in 2012, and it really allowed the USGS to rank the top business uses of LiDAR data by the total benefits identified by participants. And this NEA program allowed program scenarios to then be generated to support national elevation data acquisition, and the resulting plan was vetted across the entire community and published in a 2014 3DEP call for action. The goal of 3DEP is to acquire national terrestrial LiDAR coverage with at least 2 points per square meter by 2023 with IFSAR data in Alaska, and to really serve that data publicly when it's possible. Some of the applications for high-resolution elevation data include flood risk management, infrastructure management, which with our aging infrastructure is a growing national concern. Other applications include precision forestry, archaeology, wildfire management, planning and response, as well as alternative energy. It can really be used to even determine solar potential. It also helps detect air navigation obstacles for aviation safety, and geologic hazards is a critical application area for LiDAR, and it can be used to reveal previously unmapped faults and map landslides, which is particularly important for Puerto Rico. So having a funded national program such as 3DEP provides the systematic approach to that acquisition and processing and dissemination of LiDAR data, and stakeholders can then realize more benefits when consistency of the data lifecycle is a focus. Additionally, a systematic approach really permits larger entities such as federal government agencies to contribute, which in turn can lessen the burden on the state and local partners. So the USGS published these fact sheets for each state to summarize the goals and potential benefits of the 3D elevation program, and here we see portions of the fact sheet that was published for Puerto Rico back in February 2016. Now on page 2 of that fact sheet, the top reported business uses and reported annual benefits are listed along with what the USGS identified as the next steps for successful 3DEP implementation for Puerto Rico. And this shows that stakeholders in Puerto Rico reported flood risk management, natural resources conservation, sea level rise and subsidence as their top 3 business uses of high resolution elevation data with the highest reported annual benefits. But the other business uses listed are really important to note as well. Coastal zone and infrastructure management. We also see geologic resource assessment and hazard mitigation. And these really made sense to me, having worked for the USGS Coastal Marine Hazards and Resources Program for so many years. But I also appreciated that the next steps being listed on the fact sheet included the importance of increasing communication about how this program can benefit the community. You can spend countless hours and resources on planning and implementing a program to acquire and provide data, but if the data aren't used, if people don't know where to access the data, if they don't know how to use it, all of that effort is diminished. So if we enlarge the map from that first page of the fact sheet, we see that as of fall 2015, 3DEP quality level 2 LiDAR data, that's 2 points per square meter and at least a 10-centimeter vertical RMSE in non-vegetated areas was planned for acquisition. And the program went on to collect that data between 2016 and early 2017, but then later in 2017, Hurricane Maria hit. She made landfall in Puerto Rico on September 20th, 2017 as a Category 4 hurricane. That's the strongest hurricane to hit Puerto Rico in over 80 years. The rainfall and the winds caused so much devastation throughout the island. And so we have that 3-depth data that was just recently required before Hurricane Maria, and it's still really useful to provide pre-hurricane elevations. But what about how the island looked after the hurricane? So this ability to better understand the landscape using LiDAR data is really the impetus of my project. The 3-depth program recognizes the value of having high-res elevation data available to scientists or natural resource managers or other program stakeholders, especially for natural hazard recognition, the assessment, and mitigation support. And they even summarized how these kind of data can aid with applications in a fact sheet, and that's what we're seeing on the left. And in response to the 2017 hurricanes, including Harvey, Irma, and Maria, supplemental funding was provided by Congress to the USGS in 2018 to support high-resolution elevation data collection in hurricane-impacted areas to aid with the recovery and rebuilding that's necessary. Now, the funding supported a post-Hurricane Maria LiDAR collection for Puerto Rico and the U.S. Virgin Islands that started in 2018, and it just concluded this year. So the graphic on the right is showing you the acquisition blocks labeled in order of acquisition, and those data are currently being QA/QC'd by the USGS, and final acceptance is expected soon, which is really exciting. But if you pause for a moment and say you live in Puerto Rico, for example, I had a chance to visit just last December, and that's more than a year after Maria hit. And on my approach to the San Juan airport, the sea of blue I was seeing out the plane window wasn't the water. It was all of the blue tarps that stretched across so many roofs that they started to blend together. And the Army Corps of Engineers provided these tarps as temporary covering for roofs that were damaged during the hurricane, but they were only meant to last 30 days or so, not the entire year. And I live in St. Petersburg, Florida, so I really thought I understood hurricanes. I've been here for almost 20 years now, and I thought I understood how a community responds and the recovery needed and things like that, but that visit to Puerto Rico was really eye-opening for me. I had the chance to speak to some of the colleagues who live down there, and it was 6 months before power was restored, 6 months of drinking bottled water and eating canned foods when they were available. Now, supplies were largely cut off due to landslides blocking the roads. So my question is, when these post-Hurricane Maria LiDAR data are made available, how can they help the Puerto Ricans? The federal, state, local government stakeholders, we've got GIS specialists and LiDAR analysts really standing by to ingest the data, but what about the citizens? So I'd really like to help improve the visibility and the usefulness of the data, and I believe a good way to start is to show where there were changes in the landscape after Hurricane Maria. Change detection using LiDAR has so many applications. We can identify landslides, we can aid in planning and management, whether that's for infrastructure or emergency response or resilience. And earlier this month, a story map was published showing that over 70,000 landslides were triggered by Hurricane Maria. Now, I wanted to kind of put this in perspective geographically, so I compared it to Pennsylvania, the home of Penn State. Puerto Rico is approximately 13 times smaller than Pennsylvania, and scientists recorded over 70,000 landslides in such a concentrated area, and they used a combination of remote sensing and field assessments, according to that story map, to detect them. Now, detecting the change using LiDAR data would provide a way for the scientists to evaluate their work, perhaps even permit automated identification approaches in the future, similar to the approaches using temporal imagery. So the proposed objectives of this project are to detect volumetric change for the island of Puerto Rico to support the identification of geomorphic processes such as landslides, coastal changes from shoreline movement, beach erosion or accretion, to the migration of dunes, while also supporting the identification of man-made and natural structural changes with infrastructure and vegetation. The products to be generated include pre-Hurricane Maria digital terrain and surface models, post-Hurricane Maria digital terrain and surface models, and Delta terrain and surface models, as well as corresponding FGDC compliant metadata. all of these products will then be made available and visible via an online narrative, whether that's a web app that supports a slider function, so the viewer could slide between the pre and post models, or maybe a story map describing the entire process with links to where the data sets can be downloaded. The aim of this project is to inform citizens to the availability of the data while showing them one of the ways it can be used. Hopefully it will also aid natural resource management, emergency and resilience planning and management, as well as other initiatives, but I just want to make sure people are aware that these data are out there and how they can help. As for the data and software needed to complete the project, these include the pre-Hurricane Maria 3-depth LiDAR data that's available for download from the national map. These data were acquired between 2016 and 2017, and they're provided in LAST format version 1.4 in the state plane coordinate system referenced to NAD83 horizontally and PRVD02 vertically. These data were acquired to meet 3-depth quality level 2, which is a point density of at least 2 points per square meter, and a 10-centimeter RMSE vertical accuracy in non-vegetated areas. QL2 data density supports the generation of a 1-meter horizontal resolution raster. That's important to note. Now, the post-Hurricane Maria supplemental LiDAR that was acquired between 2018 and 2019 will be provided again in LAST version 1.4 in the state plane coordinate system referenced to NAD83 horizontally and PRVD02 vertically, and the data were acquired this time to meet 3-depth quality level 1, and that's a point density of at least 8 points per square meter, still with that 10-centimeter RMSE vertical accuracy in non-vegetated areas. Now, while the QL1 data supports the generation of a half-meter resolution raster, further research is being done to assess whether it's more appropriate to super sample the pre-hurricane data to produce a half-meter horizontal resolution raster, or to subsample the post-hurricane data to produce a 1-meter horizontal resolution raster, because research shows pros and cons to both approaches, but in the end, the horizontal resolution of the rasters must match before they're subtracted. Otherwise, we'll detect false changes, or false changes, I should say, will be reported. Now, for the processing software, I propose to use LP360. It's a LiDAR point cloud processing software from the GeoQ group. And while this analysis could be done in a variety of softwares, LP360 is used in other Penn State LiDAR courses. And it's also available in a standalone version as well as in the ARC environment. Now, since leveraging the point cloud task or PCT functionality is really important, I believe that at least the standard license will be required. My proposed methodology focuses on detecting volumetric change, and in order to eliminate some variability, it's prudent to reclassify the data to ensure that both data sets are classified with the same approach and parameters. Now, it may be necessary to first reproject the data from the state plane coordinate system into a more point cloud task-friendly system for LB360, and then I'll work to reclassify the data starting with the compilation of a ground macro to reset all but water points back to class 1, where then I can filter low noise and assign that to class 7. I can filter high noise, assign that to class 18. These two classes aren't shown in the diagram on the left because I focused on the classes I'd be using for the models for clarity. So once classes 1, 7, and 18 are set, I can adjust the macro steps based on the results of the summary statistics report produced by LP360 to account for the differences in elevation ranges in Puerto Rico. It's a lot more terrain than I'm used to working with here in Florida. Then I can assign any remaining ground points to class 2. And if time permits, I can compile a vegetation point cloud task to assign low, medium, and high vegetation to classes 3, 4, and 5 respectively, and then also compile a building point cloud task to assign buildings to class 6. From there, the digital terrain models, or DTMs, will be created using the class 2 points of both the pre- and post-Hurricane Maria LiDAR point clouds. And next, I'll subtract the pre-Hurricane Maria DTM from the post-Hurricane Maria DTM to create the delta DTM that will represent the terrain changes between the data sets. In order to detect changes in surface structure, whether man-made or natural, think infrastructure or vegetation, I'll first normalize the pre- and post-Hurricane Maria digital surface models, or DSMs, by subtracting the pre- and post-Hurricane Maria DTMs that were created from the pre- and post-Hurricane Maria DSMs. Then the normalized pre-Hurricane Maria DSM will be subtracted from the normalized post-Hurricane Maria DSM, resulting in a delta DSM that will show where changes occurred. Now, in theory, since my main goal is to focus on volumetric change, which can be done by subtracting one normalized DSM from another normalized DSM, the additional classification steps I mentioned earlier for vegetation buildings aren't necessary unless I want to separate which points were used as sources for my DSMs, but these additional classes could be really useful if we revisit the point cloud with any questions, or it would also provide a way to create DSMs from just those points, meaning we could avoid the normalization step. But I wanted to include it here in this methodology to ensure if people just had those raster layers, they understood a more comprehensive approach. For anticipated results, I think they're going to reflect those documented in a similar study. It was a pilot study I undertook for Mexico Beach, Florida, after Hurricane Michael, and we did this during GEOG 81 with Professor Schuckman. For this pilot study, the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers National Coastal Mapping Program collected LIDAR data in 2015, serving as a pre-Hurricane Michael baseline. Now, after Hurricane Michael made landfall in the Florida Panhandle in October 2018, the Army Corps Engineer Jobeltex program acquired post-Hurricane Michael LIDAR for FEMA, and then these two LIDAR data sets were compared, that's what you're seeing on the left, and resulted in the graphic on the right. Now, features in this graphic depicted in red and maroon were lost, so you can immediately identify trees and vegetation and buildings, even the pier, that were lost between these two data sets. Additionally, areas in cream color also show loss, but at a much smaller volume. Now, I thought it was really interesting to see that you can identify few buildings in royal blue, which means these buildings were erected sometime after the pre-Hurricane Michael LIDAR data were flown in 2015, but before the post-Hurricane Michael LIDAR data were flown in 2018. So this point will be extremely important to communicate for the Hurricane Maria change detection. And what's helpful is that the pre-Hurricane Maria LIDAR data was collected in 2016 and into 2017, not leaving too much time for new construction, but it still needs to be explained really well to people so they understand that these pre and post data sets aren't immediate snapshots of before and after Hurricane Maria. Similarly, I expect to see evidence of earthworks made in recovery efforts in post-Hurricane LIDAR data. It's to be expected, and since acquisition was started in 2018 and went into 2019, I do expect to be able to really visually see in the Delta DTM and Delta DSM these striking changes, but I also want to make the point to any users of the data that the horizontal and vertical accuracies of the LIDAR data sets influence the scale at which change can be quantified. So a good example is if you've got both the pre and post hurricane LIDAR that both have that vertical RMSE of 10 centimeters in non-vegetated areas, it's critical to note that you can't do a super fine millimeter scale vertical analysis. It's just not appropriate with these data. So I plan to note all of these caveats both in the metadata but also highlight them in that online narrative. So these detected changes really can be used by natural resource managers to focus their mitigation efforts for future events, or they could be used by the public to see a graphic like this and immediately assess changes to buildings or roads and other infrastructure. But my main concern is the enormity of the pre and post-Hurricane Maria data sets. The pilot area we're seeing here is less than 1 square mile. Puerto Rico is over 3,500 square miles. The pre-Hurricane Maria data set, when I pulled it off the national map, consists of over 4,400 LAST files and is hundreds of gigabytes, and that's only with 2 points per square meter, not the 8 that the post-Hurricane Maria LIDAR data is going to be delivered with. So this kind of segues me to the project timeline, and we're currently in December, and I hope to learn soon what revisions are advised for the project. I've begun working with the pre-Hurricane Maria LIDAR data, and as soon as I get the green light, I'll really start preparing those macros to get those reclassified. And working on that will really allow me to fine-tune the workflow and preparation of the post-Hurricane Maria LIDAR data delivery. And then while processes are running, I'll be able to develop the online narrative framework. And I plan to present my working results at the end of March and then incorporate any final revisions in April, permitting me to submit my final work in May. So my abstract has been submitted for the 2020 ASPRS annual conference taking place in Washington, D.C., March 23rd through 25th as part of GEO Week. And this time frame is important because it aligns closely with the estimated public release of the post-Hurricane Maria LIDAR point cloud data set. So it would really serve the community well to have an online narrative available to highlight one of the many uses of this data and LIDAR data overall, especially in response to natural hazards. I've provided a list of works I've referenced so far with hyperlinks when available. And I'd also like to take a moment to acknowledge Professor Schuckman for advising me throughout this process, the USGS Coastal Marine Hazards and Resources Program for supporting my pursuit of an MGIS from Penn State, and the USGS National Geospatial Program for both the coordination of the data collections and dissemination as well as their expertise with LIDAR data. So I welcome any questions you may have or comments, and I'd especially like to hear if you've identified any missing pieces to my proposal. Thank you so much.
Any questions? I think you've overwhelmed them because you've got a lot of moving pieces and a lot of data and thing that you have to deal with.
That is true, but sometimes that's how LIDAR works. There is a lot of information and a lot of moving pieces, but if I or we as the GIS community, in this MGIS program find it a little overwhelming, can you imagine what the public feels when they see a data set like that? I'm trying to remove that. It's not a stigma per se, but that fear of people really digging in and leveraging what LIDAR data can do. Well, hopefully you guys will provide any feedback or additional questions or anything that I may need to highlight or explain more clearly in the feedback forms that we get later. I really do welcome any kind of feedback because, again, I could incorporate that, whether it's a sentence in the metadata or something to include on the online narrative. If there's some kind of tool or GUI or widget that you've seen before that could be really leveraged to help with that ingestion and understanding of the data, I'd really welcome that kind of feedback because, again, sometimes I'm so focused on what I'm accustomed to that I forget that other widgets are out there that may be really user-friendly and be leveraged by the public at large.
Thank you, Zen. I think it's Friday and everyone's very quiet. It's the quietest. Oh, see, Michelle says she's still digesting. Yeah. You presented a lot of information there, so I think you presented it very well. So thank you. So I know everyone it's lunchtime and everything, but please do ask questions. Everybody's very, very quiet today. So our next presenter is Ben, if you can load your presentation. And also don't forget to fill in the evaluation form. I've reposted the link there.
Oh, there it is. You can hear me now, right?
Yes.
Good. And I'm going to full screen this. It's full screen for you guys too, correct?
Yep.
Okay, perfect.
So whenever you're ready, Ben, go for it.
All right. There you go. Well, good morning, everybody. Thank you for attending my capstone project presentation. My name is Ben Martini, and in addition to being an MGIS student at Penn State, I also work as a wildlife specialist for the United States Department of Agriculture at both the John F. Kennedy International Airport and the LaGuardia Airport in New York City. And I'm here today to talk to you about my capstone project, which is going to be remote sensing and wildlife management using object-based image analysis for the detection of nesting laughing gulls. So just to give you guys a bit of a quick overview about what I'm going to cover in this talk, I'm going to start out with a brief background discussion of airport wildlife hazard management, focusing on wildlife management at JFK and how we have an opportunity to use the latest remote sensing technology to improve one of our annual surveys that we do at the airport. This will be followed by a look at a small-scale proof of concept test project that I carried out to demonstrate my intended capstone project methodology. And I'll be finishing up the talk with an overview of how I'll build upon that proof of concept project towards what I'm going to be carrying out for my full capstone project. So wildlife management at airports, why is it important? Well, as long as we have been flying aircraft, there have been conflicts with wildlife. Animals are able to get around a lot of the barriers that we have in place that keep the airport keep the airport a safe and secure environment. So the primary goal of wildlife management at an airport is public safety. And there are two examples I'm going to highlight for you guys, which I think are really good instances of where management broke down and we can improve, or where management broke down in keeping the airport a safe and secure place. Now, the first is US Airways Flight 1549, which I'm sure almost all of you, if not all of you, are very familiar with. This is probably one of the most famous civilian bird strike examples. And in this instance, the aircraft struck a flock of geese upon departure from LaGuardia Airport, and the pilot was forced to ditch in the Hudson River. Now, luckily in this bird strike, there were no fatalities, just a couple injuries. But unfortunately, that's not always the case. In 1995, a Boeing E-3 AWACS, which is that aircraft pictured there on the left, struck and ingested a flock of geese that were loafing off the side of a runway during takeoff, and unfortunately in this instance, all 24 passengers were killed. Now this crash is known as one of the worst bird strikes involving a military aircraft. And in total, the FAA estimates that there have been 287 fatalities between 1988 and 2017 that can be directly attributed to bird strikes. In addition, they also estimate that economic losses could be as high as $500 million per year. Now, because of these concerns, the FAA mandates that that airports have a wildlife hazard management in place as part of their Part 139 certifications to operate as a commercial airport. So being the large airport that it is, John F. Kennedy International Airport has a very comprehensive wildlife management plan. And one of the biggest concerns at the airport is the species pictured here on the right, the laughing gull. Now, the laughing gull is a species of interest to New York State because it was extirpated as a breeding bird from the state in the early 1900s due to its popularity in the hat-making trade. And it did not establish a breeding colony until the late 1970s. Now, currently, there's only one known breeding colony in the entire state, which is located at Jamaica Bay. Now, Jamaica Bay is right below the John F. Kennedy International Airport. And between 1988 and 1990, the airport staff noticed that laughing gulls were making up the majority of all the bird strikes that were happening at the airport. So in order to do something about this increased hazard to aircraft, they developed an integrated damage management plan which centered on both a shooting program as well as negative reinforcement. And the goal of this plan was to both reduce the number of birds that were using the colony, as well as to deter birds from entering the airspace around the airfield. And because of the lethal aspect of this management plan, aerial surveying began in 1997 with a goal of monitoring the impact that that management plan was having on the nesting colony, since it's so important to the state. Now, between 1997 and 2017, this survey was conducted what I like to call the hard way. We used large panchromatic aerial photos, which were printed out and broken down into a grid on a clear overlay sheet. And then you'd take a pen and a magnifying glass, and you'd have to comb through the entire thing looking for nests in the imagery. Once that was done, the biologist would go back, count all the nests within each grid to get a total number for that grid, and then would add all the grids together to get a total population estimate for the entire marsh that they were breeding in. Now, this was supplemented by a triennial ground truthing survey. The staff would go out into the field every 3 years, and they would put the grids out in the marsh itself and then count all the birds actually on the marsh to compare that to their accuracy, to compare that to the numbers they were determining from the aerial survey in order to generate an error matrix of their accuracy between the two. Now, there are two really big problems with this methodology. It's extremely time consuming. It takes a really long time to comb through the whole image to find laughing gull nests, and it's also prone to human error. You might miss nests in the imagery while you're looking for nests, and you can't even miss nests when you're going back to total all those nests for the entire survey. So in 2018, we made the first attempt at improving how the surveys are conducted by incorporating ArcGIS Pro as a central part of the methodology. ArcGIS Pro was used to digitize the nests, and it improved our workflow for finding the nests because now we could use color imagery for the first time to more easily identify nests based on their color compared to the background. And the final product was now a single, easily accessible digital data set rather than a huge collection of printed maps and nest locations that you'd have to pull out from a closet anytime you wanted to double check things. It also simplified how we determine the total number of nests. We basically eliminated the chance of errors when you're going back to total the number of nests detected, because now all you had to do was look in the attribute table and look at the number of entries you have on there to calculate the total population size. But although this was a big step in the right direction, it still leaves room for improvement. We didn't really address the efficiency problems because it still requires the staff to manually comb through the entire image to look for nests, and it's still prone to human errors. You might miss nests while you're doing your initial search of the imagery. So in considering how I could further improve this methodology at JFK, I did a little bit of digging around in the remote sensing field to see what was being done in other projects studying wildlife. And I actually found that there's been a long history of using remote sensing to survey wildlife populations. This project is one good example, but there's two more I'd like to point out. Emperor penguins have long been studied using remote sensing techniques. They look for their fecal stains against the white Arctic background in order to determine their breeding locations from satellite imagery. Wombats are another species that have been surveyed using remote sensing. They dig these very large warrens, which you can see there in the picture on the right, which again can be detected from satellite imagery due to its size and the resolution of the imagery we now have available. Now, in doing my digging, one of the new technologies that came up that I thought would be excellent for our project is object-based image analysis. Object-based image analysis is a software that allows you to segment an image and then apply the elements of image interpretation to that image to automatically extract the features that you're interested in. And this has been used in a couple instances already. In 2011, lesser flamingo populations at the Camphors Dam in South Africa were surveyed with object-based image analysis technology, and they found that they could achieve a 99% detection accuracy when compared with manual searching, which is a great indicator for our project. Another project in 2017, white-bellied eagles in Western Australia were surveyed using a combination of object-based image analysis software and the software known as Maxent to map nest locations for continual monitoring. And they found that this really helped to simplify the process of searching for nests because it reduced their total search area down from what was previously a really even large search area than what we were working with. So in order to apply object-based image analysis to what we're doing at JFK, I developed the following two project goals and a couple objectives. My project goals for this project will be to improve the efficiency and effectiveness of the laughing gull nest survey at Joko Marsh, and to also contribute to the body of research about applying remote sensing and object-based image analysis techniques to the field of wildlife management. And my objectives for achieving these goals will be to first develop a comprehensive object-based image analysis methodology that builds upon the current methodology used to find laughing gulls nests in the aerial imagery at JFK Airport, primarily by developing a rules-based expert system for nest extraction using eCognition. I'm also going to design and develop a software tool that automates the execution of the entire workflow, allowing the population to be surveyed with minimal training in the software. So that about wraps up the discussion of the background for my project. And next I'll be talking about the proof of concept work that I've already had the chance to complete. I was able to complete this proof of concept work in satisfying the requirements for the first class of my fall semester, and I had a couple of goals for this proof of concept project. First, I wanted to test the feasibility of my proposed capstone methodology, particularly with how it relates to Objective 1. I also wanted to garner initial lessons learned to improve my project when I move it up to scale. And finally, I wanted to provide some early results to demonstrate the expected benefits and the value of this project to the many stakeholders that are involved at JFK Airport to get them behind my work. So just to orient you guys who don't live in the tri-state area a little bit with where we're going to be working, this is an overview map of Long Island and the tri-state area. And you can see that John F. Kennedy International Airport is located down here in the bottom left, right on top of Jamaica Bay. Now, if we zoom in on that area, you can see what will be the study area for my capstone project. Now, this is Joko Marsh, right here, these 3 islands, and this is the area where laughing gulls nest in Jamaica Bay. And you can just looking at this picture, you can see why it's such a problem. Here's runway 4 left, 22 right, one of the 4 runways at the airport, and right where that runway ends is where the birds are hanging out. So for my proof of concept project, we're going to zoom in a little bit more, and this is the subset study area I used of the full capstone study area. This is a 550,000 square meter study area, and I wanted to keep it at this small size because the imagery that we used to pick out the laughing gull nest is very high resolution, and I wanted to keep processing times relatively reasonable before I move things up to scale. So to complete this proof of concept project, I used the following 4 data sources. The first was the 2018 high resolution orthophotos of Joko Marsh. Now, these are 3-band aerial images that the USDA biologists used in ArcGIS Pro to actually digitize all the laughing gull nest locations. And this is actually really high resolution imagery, and it's pretty cool to take a look at because you can actually see the birds sitting on the nest. I also used the New York City land cover raster data 6-inch resolution data set. This is a data set available from the city, and it's a land cover layer that covers the entire city. For our study area, it allowed me to separate between areas of water and areas of land. The third data set I used was the New York City topobathymetric 2017 LiDAR data set. Now, this is a quality level 1 data set that I primarily used to generate a DEM layer to determine the height of different locations on the marsh. And the last data set I used was a 2018 manually digitized laughing gull nest locations. These are the actual locations that the USDA biologists digitized, and it's primarily used as a comparison to determine how much more effective my proposed automated method is when compared to the previous manual methodology that we used to use. So this is the workflow that I developed to complete my proof of concept project, and it's what I plan to be the foundation for my capstone project, and it's broken down into 3 stages. It starts out with the pre-processing stage, where I take the input data sets and prepare them for use in our software for this project, which is eCognition. And it's also during this stage that I develop an image interpretation key, which I'm going to get into in a little more detail in a minute. Once everything was ready to go and prepared, it was exported from ArcGIS Pro into eCognition, and during this second stage, which is the rules-based expert system development stage, I set about building the rule set that actually runs through the imagery and uses those elements of image interpretation to extract the nest locations. Now, these nest locations are then turned into a shapefile of point features and then exported into the final stage. Now, the last stage of my workflow is the evaluation, documentation, and reporting stage. And this stage was primarily concerned with evaluating the success of the rule set through a visual examination of the output, a comparison with the manually digitized laughing gull nest locations, and a quantitative accuracy assessment where I generated an error matrix to determine how well my rule set performed. So moving back a little bit, you'll recall that I mentioned I developed an image interpretation key. An image interpretation key is a great way to define which of the 8 elements of image interpretation that you're interested in using to identify objects in aerial imagery. And so for this project, I used 4 elements of image interpretation. The first element is the site element. And looking at this picture right here, it's a zoomed in view of the marsh. You can see that site is something we could take advantage of because laughing gulls are choosing to build their nests in specific locations on the marsh based on the geography. You can see this is a clump of nests right here, and they're choosing to build in this area because it's above the tide line. They're not choosing to use these lower areas that are subject to flooding. So site is something we can look for when trying to identify laughing gull nests. Zooming in on one of those nests, you can see the next element of image interpretation is tone, and tone refers to the spectral characteristics of the objects that we're interested in extracting. Now, tone is something we can take advantage of to find these laughing gull nests because the nests are primarily made up of dead vegetation that the gulls have sourced from around the marsh. So they give it this nice light tan tone, which contrasts very well against the green background because the aerial imagery is collected during the green up at the beginning of the growing season. The third element of image interpretation I used is size. Now, according to the Cornell Lab of Ornithology, laughing gull nests are typically only about 1 to 2 feet in diameter. So compared to other things on the marsh, they're going to be relatively small. So size is something we could take advantage of by creating a threshold, which everything below that threshold should theoretically be a laughing gull nest. And last, I'd like to go back to this picture again real quick to illustrate the shape element of image interpretation. Now, you can see that laughing gull nests have a very distinct rounded shape because of the way the gulls build their nest out from that central egg cup. They kind of, although it's not as perfectly round as a man-made feature would be, compared to other objects that are strewn around the marsh, it's going to be a lot more of a rounded shape than those that arrive there randomly due to nature. So once I had the image interpretation key created, the next step was to translate that image interpretation key into the rule set that eCognition uses to find those objects in the imagery. Now, the first part of my rule set breaks the image down into these into this segmentation, which is all the images that which is all the objects that we run through the rule set. And it starts out looking for things using the site element of image interpretation. It separates between those areas colored in blue, which are below the tide line and laughing gull nests would avoid, and those areas that are high enough that they wouldn't be subject to the regular tidal changes and that laughing gulls tend to gravitate towards. Now, these high areas were then further filtered using the tone spectral characteristic. You can see I pulled a lot of the both large and some smaller clusters of dead vegetation out in the marsh, which I then could apply my size and shape elements of image interpretation to get down to the laughing gull nests. Now, the size element of image interpretation, again, that was a threshold. Anything below that threshold, I considered a potential laughing gull nest. And then from that size, I then applied a shape filter to find those objects that met our roundness criteria. And this is what I was left with. These yellow objects should theoretically be laughing gull nests, and these are what were turned into point features and then exported into my qualitative and quantitative analysis. Now, I first started out with a visual qualitative analysis where I overlaid those extracted points on top of the reference imagery and then examined them at a very close level just to see how well my rule set performed initially. Now, there were 2,000 nest objects extracted, and within those 2,000 objects, I found that there were examples of what we consider to be well-defined nest objects. These were nests that were successfully captured by my feature extraction rule set. There were also what we would consider to be errors of omission. Now, these are instances where nests were missed because often they were excluded due to an odd segmentation, which, although they were captured in the first two elements of image interpretation, they were filtered out when I got down to the categorizing things by shape and size. The other thing I noticed was there were quite a few errors of commission. Now, errors of commission are objects that were extracted by my feature extraction rule set, and it says they're nests, but when you actually look at them against the aerial imagery, they're not actually nests. And there were quite a few of these, and they were often due to small pieces of dead vegetation in the marsh that appeared visually similar to nests, but again, are not actually nests. It also, as part of this visual qualitative analysis, I compared the manually digitized laughing gull nest locations with the feature extraction rule sets laughing gull nest locations using a select by location tool to find points that were very close together. Now here, the digitized ones are in pink and the automatic ones are in orange. And I found that unfortunately it wasn't as good as I was hoping it would perform. There's only about a 30% match rate when compared with the manually digitized laughing gull nest locations. However, on close examine within those points, I did find that there were a number of instances where the automatic method actually picked up on nests that were missed by the manual method. So I consider this to be a good indication despite the setback, because it's an early indication that my rule set could help eliminate the human errors because it's picking up on things that the surveyors missed. But in order to provide a little more backing to those visual observations, I moved on to my quantitative analysis. Now, to perform this quantitative analysis, I created 231 accuracy assessment points and then generated an error matrix from those points. Now, looking at this error matrix, our primary concern is with the producers and users' accuracy, and specifically how they relate to the nest class, because those are the objects that we're interested in extracting. Looking first at the producer's accuracy, which is a measure of how many nest objects in the reference imagery were captured by my feature extraction rule set, I actually got a really great result. It says it's an 89%, which is much higher than the comparison with the manually digitized points would indicate. So this kind of tells us that the feature extraction rule set may be performing better than the direct comparison between the two data sets would indicate. And again, recall there were some instances of nests that were extracted by my rule set but were missed by the manual digitization. And because we've had such a variability in the past between the amount of error, perhaps the manual method needs to have another second look at it. Unfortunately, the user's accuracy was not as high as I was hoping. The user's accuracy is a measure of how many of the points that my feature extraction rule set says are nests are actually nests when you compare it against the reference imagery. And it's only 50%, which means for out of all those 2,000 nest objects I extracted, only about half of them are actually nests in the imagery. Now, this confirms the high number of errors of commission that I observed in the visual examination. And again, I was hoping for something a little bit higher. But so what do we make out of all of this? What kind of lessons learned can I take from this proof of concept work that I can apply to my capstone project? Well, first, looking at the feature extraction rule set, it will definitely require further refinement over the course of my capstone project. There were a high rate of errors of commission and only a 30% match rate with manually digitized laughing nest locations, both of which results I really would like to improve. And luckily, I already have a couple planned improvements in place. Now, the first thing I'd like to highlight is a new data source. The 2018 orthophotos were unfortunately only 3-band imagery. The 2019 orthophotos for this year that we have yet to work with are actually 4-band imagery with a near infrared band. So I'm hoping that by incorporating this additional index, I can better separate between the vegetation and the laughing nests on the marsh. I'm also planning to incorporate more advanced object-based image analysis techniques. I wasn't really able to take full advantage of the additional elements of image interpretation, such as association, because I'm still building up my skill set in object-based image analysis. So I'm hopeful that with a little more research and work, I'll be able to improve things. But my proof of concept project also has some implications for my software tool that I think are really promising. Errors of commission are not necessarily a bad thing. Even though it was a 50% error of commission rate, recall that I had an 89% producer's accuracy, which means nearly 90% of all the nests in the reference imagery should be in there among the nests. So it still has value because it changes kind of how we approach this project. It reduces the search area to a subset of the full imagery, which is a similar conclusion to the white-bellied sea eagle project found, as they also over-extracted nests from the imagery. So this tells us that the final tool will likely be best served as part of an integrated workflow, which instead of having the user just comb through the whole imagery, now it guides them through everything that was extracted for final validation, which would both provide a solution to the efficiency of having to comb through the whole imagery, hoping you find all the nests, and it also changes the task to something that should be easier for staff to work through and should hopefully reduce the human error. So now that we've looked at the proof of concept project and analyzed the results, how do I build that into the workflow, and how am I going to build upon that foundation? So this is my full capstone project workflow. You'll notice that the methodology foundation I tested during the proof of concept project remains, with several additions that I'd like to point out. First, I've already incorporated the 2019 orthophotos, as well as where I intend to include the more advanced object-based image analysis techniques. I've also incorporated a lot more iteration into my proposed workflow. When I went through the proof of concept project, I kind of just went from one step to the next, and although I looked at what improvements I could make, I didn't really go back and make them during the completion of that process. So I've built in workflow right here into the rule set development, as well as into the quality analysis, where unsatisfactory results in either of those segments will require going back to an earlier stage in order to improve things up to the standards that we're looking for in order to be confident in the nests that we're extracting. And last but not least, I've also now incorporated how I intend to develop the software tool into my workflow. And this is going to be built on an iterative process that's based on user testing and feedback. I'm planning to provide this tool throughout development to the people who are actually going to be using it in order to have them give me the necessary information to make sure it's going to be usable and produce the best results. So when all is said and done with my capstone project, I'm expecting to achieve the following things: a well-designed software tool for extracting laughing nests from aerial imagery for use by the Port Authority and USDA Wildlife Services. And this tool will have improved feature extraction results. Although we're still going to try to achieve a fully automated process, it will most likely be built with a semi-automated process in mind. And I also would like it to have the potential for expansion to different species and sources of imagery. I've gotten a lot of feedback from coworkers and ideas for how to apply this project to other work that we do. And I'd also like to incorporate using things like UAV imagery into the workflow, a way to load that into my tool. I'm also hopeful that this project will be a contribution to the body of knowledge regarding the value of object-based image analysis techniques for studying wildlife. Although there are some good examples currently, it's still a growing part of the remote sensing field, and I'd like for my project to help ease that transition. So for my proposed project timeline, the majority of the project work will occur between January and April. And I'm planning to have everything wrapped up by May 2020 at the latest. For my capstone project presentation, I'm planning to present it at the Society for Conservation GIS's annual conference, which although they haven't announced it yet, it should be in early July 2020. So that about wraps it up for my capstone project. I'd like to thank Doug Miller for helping me work through this entire process and kind of plan things out and giving me some very valuable feedback. And I'd welcome any questions or comments that you guys have about it at this time. Can't really see the chat. I'm not sure how to open that from the share menu.
Yeah, sometimes it's easier if you
there it is.
close. Yeah, there aren't any questions yet. Everybody.
Oh, okay.
Come on,
Hi, Ben. I had a
everybody.
quick question.
Sure. Let's see if I can
Great. I wondered on the data sets that you were preparing, if you were, and forgive me, but you probably did. I don't know if I missed it or if I just blanked on seeing it. Were all of the data sets oriented to the same horizontal and vertical datums before the object detection was undertaken?
Yeah, they were. I made sure to go through that as part. I kind of breezed through everything I did for the pre-processing, just to kind of give you guys an overview of the whole thing, everything I've worked on. But yeah, no, I did go in and make sure everything was correctly aligned with each other, because yeah, especially when you're using an object-based image analysis platform like eCognition, it's very important that all your data sets lined up. So yes, that is something that I performed as part of the initial workflow.
Fantastic. Thanks for clarifying that.
Well, thanks for the question.
So I have a question.
Sure.
So you're doing all this monitoring of bird species and stuff. How does that get used in flight safety and things like that?
So at the airport, it's because of the we keep monitoring just to kind of keep tabs of what kind of birds that we have around the airport, and that feeds into the kind of management strategies that they put into place. And it's not just like the lethal stuff that we do. There's also, that's like the kind of the step of last resort for any of the management plans that we implement at the airport. Managing wildlife is and I can talk about this for probably another 25 minutes. But it's built on managing a species habitat, their access to food. They need food, shelter, and like water in order to be able to successfully survive. So that kind of, like, if you observe like you're having like a high number of raptors, which are birds of prey, sitting around the airport, that's kind of an indication that, hey, maybe we need to go back and take a look at what kind of exclusions we have on tall objects around the airport, or what kind of things we need to have, and maybe we need to remove the like tall trees that are right against the fence line. It plays into that kind of information for the airport. In terms of the laughing gulls, they're a species of concern, so they're in a wildlife refuge, so there's not much we can do about it. So in regards to this project, it's more just a check to make sure that although we're doing the work needed to keep the birds from flying over the airport, it's not like causing us to totally decimate the population, which it hasn't. It's reduced the number of birds, and compared to like the number of strikes they were having to laughing gull, or because of laughing gulls in the early 1990s, it's gone way down. And we've noticed over the past couple, I want to say like 5 years or so of the survey, that the population has gotten to like it's reduced a little bit, but it's also gotten to a plateau, and the birds are tending to avoid the area more so now because of the management plans that are in place, making it a less attractive place for them to come hang out. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, thank you.
Okay.
Yeah.
I still haven't figured out how to look at the comments with this share screen. Is there any
Is there a
comment
trick?
questions? I'm not sure. I'm not used to looking at this overview, so I'm not really sure. Oh, here we go.
Hey Ben, yeah, if you highlight the bottom of your screen, you
Yeah, I
should
found
see
it.
chat.
Thank you. Anybody else?
No other questions?
Hey Ben, I think you talked about if you didn't, this would be my question, like what kind of like evaluation metrics do you have to compare like the manual method versus automation method? But I think you overviewed it. Do you
Yeah,
mind just panning to that slide real quick?
Sure. And I just kind of put an image of what I did here. I didn't really zoom into it. Again, I was covering a lot. But so this is the comparison. I'm talking about those errors of commission. Actually, when I looked at the data set, you can see it's picking up, and I did mention it's mostly like little small segments of dead vegetation that I wasn't able to filter out, but especially like right down here, there are actually no gull nests down here. Just because it's really subject. This is kind of the edge of the marsh, which gets a lot of the like tidal waters coming in from the ocean going over it. So they don't like to nest on that area, and you can see where the errors of commission are. But it was mainly just comparing things by location tool, where I found the points that were close together.
How often would the old model or your proposed like new model of going about this would involve like you guys actually physically going out there to confirm or deny like maybe accidental errors?
Yeah,
or
that's like an actually a pretty interesting question we're having a lot of discussion about right now, because we had the previous methodology that we went through, which was the manual surveys, which I had to do like twice, and I can tell you doing it twice was enough to never want to do it again. But that was supplemented by every 3 years we would go out into the marsh and like delineate where those grids were on the marsh with like really long pieces of string and rope, and then you would actually go out and count all the nests that were in that grid, and then you would look at the numbers that you had from the aerial imagery and we would compare those two. So that's how we did it with the old method. And talking with the biologist who helped us design that method, he was saying that now that we've changed things with using ArcGIS Pro, and now that we're going to further change things with incorporating this automated method, it may even be worthwhile to readdress that every 3 years and do like a 5-year or something or such baseline study just to see how consistent we can get before maybe going back to that 3-year ground check. So we're going to have to reevaluate that, but historically it's been every 3 years that somebody has to go slog it out in the marsh.
Do you think after 5 years you might have to reapproach this same exact project and do it again?
Hopefully not, but we'll see what happens. It's always anything in the wildlife field is always like kind of an adventure, just figuring things out.
Great, thank you very much.
No problem. Thank you everybody for your time and attention.
Okay, let's get our next presenter up. Max.
All right, let me get set up here. All right.
So whenever you're ready, go for it.
Absolutely, thanks. So hello guys, my name is Max McDonald and welcome to my capstone project proposal. I'm set to present in the 2020 summer semester. I've been working on earning my master's in GIS from Penn State since October 2017, and I'm very excited to share with you guys my idea for an analysis that represents the culmination of the skills and knowledge I've learned throughout the program. This proposal gives me a chance to open a discussion with you guys regarding my project idea so that the feedback generated can be used to refine the project and produce a better result. My topic today is most applicable to certain audiences. In my opinion, the information and proposal presented here is intended mostly for individuals or groups within the transportation and urban planning industries, as well as our general GIS user community. Originally, I wanted to do my project on the act of estimating rooftop storm damage using LiDAR data, but after taking a few more classes towards my degree, I decided to switch gears towards working with raster data and continuous data sets. This October, I was actually on my iPhone's map application, panning across the United States through the transit layer, looking for places that I believed would benefit from the creation of a new railroad. Unbelievably, I saw the potential between Las Vegas and Los Angeles before my research led me to discover that Virgin Trains USA is currently going through with the idea. I found an article by Mike Akers in the Las Vegas Review-Journal on October 15th, which was actually 2 days after I was panning around on the iPhone Maps application. So that was enough for me to make it the centerfold of my capstone project. So I'm looking forward to any questions or comments after the presentation, and thank you guys for joining me today. So let's get started. As I stated earlier, Virgin Trains USA is in their own proposal phase for this idea. They want to connect Southern California via the town of Victorville to Las Vegas by a high-speed railway. In my research, I discovered that the primary investors in this project are a group called Fortress Investment Group, LLC, and Virgin Trains USA. Fortress was founded in 1998, and they're a global investment manager with about $41 billion in assets under their belt as of this past summer. Fortress was recently acquired by a Japanese company called SoftBank, but it's still operating independently under the new parent company. Virgin Trains USA is a subsidiary of the Virgin Group, the group being founded back in 1970. They all have experience operating train lines in the United Kingdom since 1997 with a Scottish company called Stagecoach, until recently there was a Stagecoach United Kingdom ban in this year. Brightline is the former name of Virgin Trains USA's rail service in Florida, which was founded in 2012. The train line runs from central Miami and will eventually extend to the Orlando International Airport. In 2018, Virgin Trains USA made their minority investment into Brightline, and now they and Fortress are seeking funds to build the high-speed rail line between Victorville and Las Vegas. The project's motivation comes from a large portion, roughly about 29% of Las Vegas's annual tourism originating from Southern California, as well as relieving congestion on the dreaded Interstate 15, the only highway connecting the two places. The two groups are currently still in talks with various Clark County, Nevada, and California departments regarding taxation and funding via bonds, and they're on track to begin construction in 2020 with the hopes to begin servicing travelers in 2023. My project proposal is three-pronged. Primarily, I intend to propose 3 different corridors that can contain a high-speed train using geospatial data and suitability criteria that propose a least cost path. These routes are determined by assigning raster cells an overall cost value. In other words, what is the cost value incurred or level of resistance experienced when traversing over a space? These routes are determined, in this case, like raster cells covering my project area represent a 30 by 30 meter area. Furthermore, GIS can help to analyze raster data on a source cell by neighbor cell basis to determine the path someone or something could take that would result in the lowest amount of cost or resistance experienced by the subject. Using various amounts of raster data, such as the National Land Cover Database, for instance, to create cost surfaces, a GIS can help compile those cost surfaces into overall cost values and assign them to each raster cell in the project area. In reality, cost values are determined by our decision makers, our stakeholders, and possibly the analysts involved in the project, and least cost paths are only as accurate as the amount of cost surfaces used to produce them. Secondly, after the creation of these LPCs or LCPs from Victorville to Las Vegas, specifically an area near McCarran International Airport, the proposal aims to compare these corridors among themselves as well as to the already established highway, Interstate 15. Here, the project will be analyzing the accumulated cost between the source cell and destination cell and analyzing the strengths and weaknesses of each route while in the process suggesting the most optimum route. Finally, the big question I'm attempting to answer, even if Virgin Trains builds this railroad, what kind of impact will it have on the populations and services? More specifically, questions like, will a new train line be more cost effective for an individual to travel to Las Vegas from Victorville? Which census tracts in particular of Southern California become more accessible to Las Vegas with a new railroad? The aim here is to use as much relevant and publicly available geospatial data as possible in order to create a high level of accuracy. Although I'd like to recognize that there are other elements that fall outside the realm of GIS that could impact the ultimate corridor that's chosen. While the project will not address those outside factors in depth, it will nonetheless recognize some of the important ones. Lastly, some of the ArcGIS toolboxes the project will be utilizing are spatial analyst, network analyst, the data management toolbox, as well as the conversion analysis and geocoding toolboxes. Before I go any further into my methodology, I just want to give you guys a better idea of the study area's characteristics with some maps regarding the data I've already been exploring. Here I have a map of the proposal's overall study area, Southern California and Clark County, Nevada. Within is your basic road and highway infrastructure, highlighting Interstate 15, its length and path. One can also view the general locations of Los Angeles and Victorville, California, Las Vegas, Nevada, as well as the public and military airports that are of concern to the analysis. The most important information that one should derive from this map is that Interstate 15 is in fact the only direct route into Las Vegas from these counties. San Bernardino County and Clark County are colored differently just to depict that the LCP analysis will only be conducted in these two counties. Next, I have a map depicting the more narrowed study area that I just mentioned. Here, the National Land Cover data set from 2016 is overlaid over the counties, and this data set will be one of many that will help create the least cost path options. Important things I like to point out is that the majority, approximately 75% of the land cover and use classifications are labeled as shrub scrubland, followed by barren land and grassland at approximately 9% and 8% respectively. This is important because shrub and scrubland and barren land, less the grassland, are suitability criteria. And it's good to know that most of the land falls under land uses that I'm going to deem suitable. Data sets like this one are crucial for constructing cost surfaces and determining what is suitable versus not suitable, but I'll address the uses of each data set in a later slide. Moving forward, elevation is another factor in helping to determine least cost paths, as I'll bring up later. Percent slope rise is only acceptable at a small threshold, and digital elevation models are a key source of creating slope maps in GIS. They also help us to understand the terrain of any study area visually. Here's a digital elevation model with 500-meter contours overlaid on top, which was supplied from the USGS national map. As one can visualize in this slide, the map points to the highest and lowest points of both counties. You could probably visualize the Euclidean distance between Victorville and Las Vegas, and it's satisfying to learn that the deepest and highest points generally lie far away from the corridor of I-15. Again, this is just another map to help better understand the project area for this proposal. Next, I have a slope map I mentioned earlier and a different map layout format I'm trying out for myself. This is manually classified to meet the aforementioned criteria regarding percent slope rise. In dark green, I have colored areas of land that contain 0 to 1% slope increase. In light green are areas that contain a percent slope increase between 1 and 4%, while everything in red is any piece of land that contains a percent slope rise of over 4%, which would not be suitable for the path modeling. This map will be another heavy addition to the cost surfaces because, as one can see with the naked eye, there are not too many areas that a railroad can squeeze through regarding percent slope rise criteria. However, with further research in the train line construction topics, I may be able to find some information that loosens the restrictions for a different model of a LCP. As of right now, my research has only suggested the thresholds you see before you here. Southern California is already host to a number of local and statewide rail lines. The line that already connects Victorville to the rest of Southern California is named the Southwest Chief and actually extends to Barstow, California, which is the spot right over here, which is, as you can see, a little bit closer than Victorville. Altogether, there are 24 different train lines across 8 different Southern California counties. One challenge I'm currently addressing is the creation of the actual network of train lines. Once I'm able to create the network of railroads, I'll be able to use this and other road and transportation networks in establishing my accessibility index. Ultimately, this data, which was geocoded based on the station's addresses, will assist me in determining which areas of Southern California will become more accessible to Las Vegas. Really quickly, I just want to overview that polyline challenge I'm experiencing in trying to create the transportation network. Here I have my Python script for the Amtrak line specifically, which was inspired from my class Geography 485, which is a Python programming and ArcGIS class. Yet I'm not having as much success as I did in the class project. As the script stands, I'm able to populate the arrays with something, but it's clearly not the coordinates of each station, and my polyline shapefile does not appear in ArcMap when it's added to the frame. If anyone has any suggestions or ideas to help with this, I'd love to hear them. However, I plan on collaborating with my professor from 485 to solve this, if he's willing. I remember it took me 18 hours straight to do that class project, so I expect another day or two of troubleshooting just to go into this script and following a solution. I have to repeat the process for the other 23 train lines as well. A little background on my data. Most of it is gathered from government sources such as the USGS, the US Census Bureau, the EPA, state departments, and the MRLCC. I expect to get a lot of my data from public data portals or databases, but my train station location data was geocoded from addresses I Googled. My project settings may have been mentioned previously, but to review, I'm using the North American datum of 1983, the 2011 contiguous USA Albers projection. My linear units are in meters, and my raster data resolution is set to 30 meters. The oldest data set is the digital elevation model. However, it's impossible to know when this section of the United States was collected in the 1951 to 2018 time period. Besides the geocoded addresses, which I did myself throughout October, the Clark County roads feature class from the EPA's most recently created or updated data set. None of these data sets were already in the NAD 83 2011 Albers projection and had to be projected before I began any part of my analysis thus far. Here my presentation overviews the considerations I've already made for the analysis in regards to the data I've already compiled, which is an ongoing iterative process. Some suitability factors can be found on the left side of the screen. These I decided for myself and will be tweaked based on further research to predict other least cost paths. Otherwise, other considerations for cost and accessibility are listed in the center and right side of the screens. It's important to note that cost or resistance incurred by an individual can be more than a monetary cost. Fuel use and time are other costs. However, there can be various monetary costs such as fuel, tolls, tickets, and other unforeseen costs as you travel. So where does it all come into play? I have a lot of data presented here today, but most will be used in both parts of the analysis, less probably the airport feature classes and the NLCD from 2016, which will most likely be used during the LCP construction only. The more cost services, the better. A LCP is only as accurate as the data I have available and is only influenced by what stakeholders, decision makers, and analysts together or separately perceive to be more or less costly. As I've said, the data collection and analysis is ongoing. Accessibility, on the other hand, will be circumstantial for different locations of the project area. I will talk about some examples of what goes into making accessibility index later, but the data I've already presented meets some of the considerations I discuss here. In terms of distance, ArcMap contains a lot of Euclidean distance and allocation type tools that will help evaluate who or what is closest to certain sources or exactly how far away or close they reside from said sources. Transportation methods and networks are a derivative of the data I presented earlier, but are important to consider and refine. But consider this: who is more accessible? Is it someone who can walk to the train station and purchase one ticket to their destination? Or is it somebody who can hop into their car and drive from A to B on $10 gasoline? They both could be considered equally accessible in certain circumstances, but what are some other obstacles that increase the perceived cost of reaching a destination? In regard to my project, does living near a Southern California train station increase the accessibility of an individual more so than that someone who just prefers to drive up Interstate 15? These are just some of the main questions I propose to answer with my analysis. If it's not clear yet, I just want to put it on record that the two primary goals of my project will be the following. First, a least cost path using cost, distance, and suitability criteria will be created that depicts the shortest path a railroad can be laid upon from Victorville to Las Vegas, which will then be compared to Interstate 15 and the other options. Secondly, based on the most optimum least cost path proposed, an accessibility index will be created that describes how much more accessible Las Vegas becomes to people in Southern California. In addition to the primary goals we just addressed in the last slide, the slide lists the technical and result-related questions my project will attempt to answer. Coupled with these questions are some concerns that my analysis still has to address, namely, how can I create the analysis so that it's flexible enough? I don't want to have to reconstruct my formulas and analysis methodology to tailor a simple what-if question from a stakeholder or decision maker. I would like to identify what a GIS can do for this project scenario, but also what it can't do to help. As I stated earlier, a GIS could be useful in many different ways, but there are other elements that affect a project that exists outside geospatial analysis. Also, what considerations are going to be made post-GIS analysis via other interested parties that will not be assisted by GIS. For instance, it may be impossible to map the overall emotions individuals feel about a new train line being constructed near them or by them or right by their house. Finally, how much information can my analysis include, or how accurate and all-encompassing can it become without harming its results? I said earlier that I'm on track to graduate in the summer of 2020, so the remainder of my project will occur over the next 6 to 8 months. From this past October until present day, I've been formulating my research question. From January until the beginning of June, I intend to explore and evaluate more data, choose certain analytical methods and tools to conduct the analysis with, and examine those results and refine and summarize them. And finally, I'd like to present my findings in a professional setting somewhere between June and August. I just mentioned certain analytical methods and tools that I would like to conduct my analysis with. Here are just some examples of previous works referring to accessibility and least cost path modeling that I intend to emulate and or build upon and contrast and evaluate. In the article, a GIS methodology for assessing ecological connectivity, application to the Barcelona metro area, the authors utilize mathematical language and GIS to determine barrier effect indexes, or BEIs, and ecological connectivity indexes, or ECIs. The BEIs are all artificial land uses that create obstacles to the flow of energy, information, or matter across the spatial weight matrix. In other words, the landscape resistance. They utilize a formula BEI equals YI divided by Ymax, where YI is the value of the barrier effect in a pixel, and Ymax is the maximum value of the barrier effect over the total area. Each barrier type is issued a weight somewhere between non-existent to medium impact to critical impact. Their ecological connectivity indexes are essentially origin surfaces combined with the impedance surfaces, those created by the BEIs. Another article titled a GIS-based spatial statistical approach to modeling job accessibility by transportation mode, a case study of Columbus, Ohio. The authors use a cumulative opportunity approach. They use this approach on 3 different transportation modes for census block groups. They have job accessibility for walking, which was calculated by counting the number of jobs within a quarter mile of a given block group centroid. They have job accessibility by public transit, which is calculated within a 30-minute travel time buffer. And finally, job accessibility by car, which was calculated by a 15-minute travel time buffer of the block group centroids. Following, the authors use ordinary regression models to measure the effects of infrastructure and socioeconomic factors on job accessibility by transportation mode, and they use spatial autoregressive models to capture the spatial autocorrelation of these accessibilities. The overall mathematical equation can be described as job accessibility by transport means regressed on a set of explanatory variables together with spatial lag terms. Third is an article called Least Cost Modeling on Irregular Landscape Graphs, which contrasts the use of regular landscapes and irregular landscapes in least cost modeling. Landscape information that occurs as a continuous surface is most commonly in raster format. The author proposes 3 problems to using regular landscapes, such as pixels as cost surfaces. First, regular graphs contain a number of redundant cells that increase processing time. Secondly, graph structure is known to affect the results of least cost modeling, and the author proposes no way to evaluate your regular grid structure as to the amount of error it can cause. Thirdly, least cost modeling on regular graphs is known to contain directional biases. The author's proposition is research discovered that while connectivity measures were barely affected, processing times decreased and directional bias was less substantial when using an irregular graph via interpolation of the regular graph. Fourth example of inspiration for my project methods comes from the article Transport Accessibility Analysis Using GIS, Assessing Sustainable Transport in London. This one is designed to be flexible and used with publicly available data, which are 2 key factors for my project. The author quotes another source and describes accessibility as the ease or difficulty that opportunities, e.g. employment or services, can be reached from a location. The author describes accessibility as the opportunities of a location multiplied by the distance, cost, and time of traveling from I to J or A to B. There are general costs and there are network costs, and both can be combined based on the type of transportation networks a subject utilizes. And finally, the last source I'll talk about today is titled Ecological Relevance of Least Cost Path Analysis, an easy implementation method for landscape urban planning. Here, a group of people did attempt to use least cost paths to model the paths taken by hedgehogs when being released and returning to their natural environment. A good number of hedgehogs, I believe it was between 90 and 100, were captured unharmed and equipped with radio trackers and then released a short distance away from its original habitat. Using GIS and a very simple rudimentary least cost path model, the team were able to accurately predict which paths the hedgehogs would take back home, while also uncovering some new information. Using a landscape connectivity concept, the authors produced a cost or resistance surface applicable to hedgehogs in a urban environment and then analyzed which landscape types were utilized by the hedgehogs. While they believed a hedgehog would choose more vegetated land to move through without being seen, which was correct, they were not able to predict that it would take the hedgehog more time to traverse more vegetated areas. This is because the animal felt more safe and would forage more so than on an open street, where they would be more susceptible to contact with human. As a final note on these sources, it should be obvious I've compiled others to consider, and these are just a select few that will influence my project. One thing I've not been able to lock down is where I will be presenting my findings. On this slide, I've listed some organizations and events that are of interest to me and may contain interest for my project. I'm still open to suggestions, as some of these events fall outside the 2020 summer term, which is okay, but not if they're in the fall. And some haven't even released their event dates yet, but have had regular ones in the past during the summer. At the conclusion of my research assignment, I expect to have successfully utilized GIS knowledge and skills to interpret a least cost path that is most cost effective for an individual to travel from Victorville to Las Vegas. This assignment will also compare the pre and post railway state of Southern California census tracts accessibility to Las Vegas in order to interpret the level of positive change the new railway can provide individuals traveling to the city. And lastly, of course, I hope to receive a great mark on the project from Penn State and you guys to solidify my time and effort as a student here. And that is the conclusion of my proposal. Thank you guys so much for listening and being here today. At this time, I can answer any questions or discuss any concerns you have for it. And thank you.
Max, I have a quick question. Well, we're waiting to see if any others arise. Interesting project, I didn't realize. So from the UK, where we use lots of trains and stuff, it's kind of nice to see something like that over here as well. But out of curiosity, are you also looking to see and incorporating census information in there to see number of users or population that this might have access to this railway once you've figured out the route and stuff?
Yeah, absolutely. I'm certainly going to need census data that will help me identify those that don't have a car or or single family parent homes, and generally where the population clusters lie, because that will be influencing the accessibility matrix as to an area can become more accessible, but if there is no one living there, then it's kind of redundant and null, if that makes sense. So I definitely need population data and at least data pertaining to those that would have to walk to a public transit location, whether it be a bus or a train.
Hi, Max. If I understood correctly, it seems like having the most recent temporal data set as well as the highest resolution digital elevation model will help with the cost analysis.
Yeah, obviously the more recent, better. In regards to the DEM and the NLCD, I know the NLCD is as up to date as possible because it's the 2016 one. But the DEM, oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just going to say, if that is the case, I'll shoot you some contacts at the USGS that work specifically with California and Nevada, just in case they know of any higher resolution or more recent digital elevation models that you could leverage instead of having the such a breadth of whether you said it was from 1950s or 2018. That'll make a huge difference, I think, in the results that you're able to report and the specificity that you can put in the metadata.
Yeah, I've hugely appreciate that. As everyone else said prior to my presentation, you guys seem to all have, a professional work setting, whereas I'm just a student, so I really don't have access to that kind of resources. So that would be amazing.
I'd be happy to. I'll forward that in the feedback with email addresses, and I'd be happy to make the introductions if that would help as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for that. Does anyone else have any questions or concerns or ideas that you want to add? Definitely need help with the Python stuff. So if anyone's scripting savvy.
I will say I just finished a class with Professor O'Brien. We were working on incorporating JavaScript into web applications and making sure things plotted correctly. So if you haven't had him as a professor before, he may be another resource to just shoot some code to and say, why isn't this plotting? It could be something as simple as they're leveraging a different version of JavaScript now, which kind of happened if I pulled up old code, it would not work, but I had to use the new language or something like that. Hopefully it's something simple that's making the roadblock instead of something that will be a recoding effort.
Yeah, I remember when I was doing the class project, which was centered around tracking endangered rhinos, I was having the same issue, but my problem now is that I'm using a model of the script that was successful with that data and not with this data. So it's hopefully a new issue and not something I experienced before. But what was the name of the professor for that class?
Professor James O'Brien.
Gotcha. Yeah, I don't think I've had him before, but thanks for that. I'll shoot him a message as well. And I guess the only other issue, which I've talked about with Professor Schuckman, is when I create these transport networks of the train lines, it unfortunately is only going to be inaccurate as straight lines between the points, which is not totally realistic with how a train line runs. It just doesn't run a straight line and turn around a corner or go any which other direction. So if anyone has suggestions or advice on how to make a more accurate transportation network, I'm all ears. And I can't see the chat. I was not having the issue when Ben was doing his presentation, but now I'm seeming, I don't know how he got it up when I'm still in this full screen mode.
Don't worry about it. There aren't any chats in there at the minute, so you're fine.
Okay.
Any other questions, discussions anybody has about railway lines? No, I think that might be it.
All right. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you. So our next presenter is Jeremy, but he's actually, he just texted me, so he's actually on his way to log online. He's running a bit late. So we can either wait 8-9 minutes, unless Monica, you want to go ahead. We can wait. So if everybody's quite happy waiting, then we'll just, you can take a short break and we'll continue again in about 8 minutes or so. Great. Did you check your, I can see your presentation, Jeremy. Did you check your sound? I know we had some issues yesterday. No, I can't hear you yet. No, still nothing.
Hello, can you hear me?
Ah, we can hear you. Just hold, yeah, great. We'll just wait till 1 o'clock.
Okay, perfect.
So we'll start in about 3
Sorry about
minutes.
That's
Yep.
just crazy.
Okay, do you want to go ahead? I can't hear anything.
Sure, I'll go ahead and kick it off.
Okay, great.
Awesome. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Jeremy Bruden. My academic advisor for this project was Justine Blanford. My project proposal covers the accessibility of urban green space in Virginia Beach. So the agenda of what we'll be going over in this presentation, a little bit of background about urban green space, what it is, why everybody should actually care about it. Little description of the study area, the data used for the project, and the result analysis for the current information that I have. So what is green space? Before conducting research, I didn't have a good grasp on this. It's not a very common issue that is told about global warming, but it's all connected. There's a plethora of research outlining the benefits and necessity of green space, but many publications actually have different definitions of what it constitutes. In the context of this research, in line with other studies, I'll be looking at formally designated areas such as parks, recreational venues, playgrounds, sports facilities, and then informal green spaces such as nature trails, rivers, to repair and buffer areas around those rivers, as well as the beach and ocean fronts in the city. The growing concern over the availability and access of urban green space has been a primary issue because of the positive effect of the natural environments on the general human well-being within those urban environments. There's been systematic analysis done, and it indicates that the close proximity to urban green space dwellings has a positive impact on newborn babies, their birth weight, which is indicative of positive health in the early stages. Green space has also been linked to improved mental health facilities and status. Having access to urban green spaces can reduce the health inequalities, improve well-being, and aid in the treatment of mental illness. And some analysis suggests that physical activity in a natural environment can actually help remedy mild depression and reduce physiological stress indicators. The problem is urbanization. Urbanization or urban sprawl has really impacted the availability of urban green space, not just nationwide, but worldwide. In 2018, 55% of the world's population lived in urban areas, and there's a projected 25% increase, an increase to 68% by 2050, numbering in about 6.7 billion people living in urbanized areas. The increase in inhabitants and densification within these urban environments has exacerbated problems of green space loss, and cities, states, whole governments don't really have strong urban green space preservation policies in place. Green space also has a significant impact on the environment, especially within an urban setting. Green space produces oxygen, which helps filter harmful air and noise pollutants, including airborne particulate matter. Along with urbanization, the construction of impermeable surface in urban environments, such as roads, buildings, really a lot of man-made objects, replace the natural permeable landscape and create heat islands. Several research and studies have shown that even minimal amount of urban green space can have dramatic cooling effects on city landscapes. Research findings also reveal that the proximity is a prominent factor in the accessibility of urban green space. The standard spatial distribution of urban green space is contested at best. There's not a set standard between city to city or even by the states. It's whatever really anybody could provide, and that's the issue, is that there's no standard. The access to urban green space is a complex, multidimensional paradigm with both physical and non-physical barriers, really resulting in a lot of social demographic issues that affects the inhabitants that visit these areas. Really a key takeaway from it is environmental awareness and accounting for the local community and their use of these urban green space areas is essential when planning, because if the community won't utilize the space for what it's intended for, it's going to get minimal use. A quick overview of the population statistics for Virginia Beach shows growth dating back to 1970. The global trend towards urbanization and the demographic impacts of such change has not been lost on Virginia Beach from 2000 to 2010. The Virginia Beach population grew by about 4% and has continued to experience an approximate 2.9% annual growth rate. A bit of a background on Virginia Beach area. It's about 455,000 residents covering 114 census tracts. Some of the main features of the area that makes Virginia Beach itself actually unique is it's a coastal city covered on a majority of the sides of it. As you can see, the eastern board is all beach. The problem with that is urban green space has helped really keep a lot of land together, and the more urban green space that disappears, the more the lands deteriorate in those areas. It's a large tourist destination and gets a bunch of traffic in the summer seasons. And also notable is there is a large military presence in Virginia Beach. I'll show you the areas that those covers and the way we try to mitigate the impact of those. A little bit of a methodology overview. I'm going to start with determining the current amount of urban green space and the land use change over time from 2001 to 2016, as well as using other data sets to look at that information. After that, assessing if the current amount of urban green space is adequate for the population and doing some projection if it's going to be sustainable or if there's going to be issues. After is going to evaluate the accessibility and access to that urban green space using different boundaries, mainly tract data and likely block group data. Then evaluating the urban green space distribution equity and determining any socioeconomic correlations with the spatial distribution of the current urban green spaces. And then from all that information, providing my best recommendations on the way forward for the implementation of urban green space to best benefit Virginia Beach as a whole. Some of the data sources, as talked about previously, and some of the other briefs, a lot of this information looks similar. I have the census block groups where we pull a lot of the census information, as well as using tiger line data for the bounding areas, the USGS land cover data, Parks Rec, bikeways, transportation data, as well as Virginia address points for the analysis of accessibility. And then a unique one I'll discuss is the 1 meter Virginia statewide land cover data set, and some of the things that came up during my research with it. The first step is going to be to determine the amount of land use in 2001 and 2016, and determine if there was a change, what the change was, and reclassifying those areas. What I found is dealing with urbanized areas, Virginia Beach has a primarily northern urbanized population, where the south is more so water and marshland. It has some cropland, but there's not a lot of residents in those areas. So MassSat made a focus area, a better study area to calculate the urban access to these green spaces, and then finding the difference. And while that may not look like a lot of difference and the land use change, the numbers actually tell a different story. So for the percentage change in each area for the classification, there was a gain in all developed areas up to 4%, while all the green space areas have had a decrease. And that's the issue. You'll see that from what I've seen in the research, while there is a continuous population gain of about 3%, there's a continuous loss of urban green space. So this was mentioned about the 1 meter resolution. So these are all the same area of one suburban park, a neighborhood park. From the 30 meter resolution, it's hard to delineate what's urbanized and what's actually considered urban green space. If you see the second picture, it's being calculated as a lightly urbanized area with no green space available, which, as you can see, there's quite a bit of green space there just with some houses. Using the 1 meter resolution, it tells a much more accurate story. The problem is doing land use change on this. It's a relatively newer data set with no previous iteration, so doing a change analysis, not really likely right now. So just some of the numbers for the land use change. As I mentioned, the population change is about 3%, a positive 3%, where the urban green space change is approximately a negative 3.1% per year. That's the issue. The more people we're getting, the less green space we have per individual, and there's no fix to this right now. There's no policy in place to mitigate these issues. So continuing on the steps, using the shapefiles provided by the city, converting all those as well as the trails and other smaller considered green space areas into one shapefile. It's approximately 370 parks, only consisting of about 10.5% of the total land use in the focus area. Establishing a baseline demographic data from the census information. Mainly the analysis I've done has been on the census tract. I do plan on breaking it down to a block group to see if any other results come out of the analysis, or if I can gain any more fidelity on these areas that need better access to urban green space. As I mentioned earlier, there's a large military presence in the Virginia Beach area. The areas highlighted in blue are all the military installations, resulting in about 10% of the total research area, or about 15 square miles. The issue with those is once you put those in the calculation, it starts to skew the data and where these urban green space needs are. And the city doesn't have access to manipulate the lands there, and it's not very accessible for majority of the public. So I took those out of the research. Then using the land use change data, the tract boundaries, the decreases or increases, as well as existing public green space, conducting a hotspot analysis in order to determine if there's any clustering, if there's any correlation in the data, to see where these hotspots are, and using those in the research. So accessibility, as talked about in some of the previous briefs, it's about access. There's other studies have done either Euclidean or a network-based approach. I decided to do both. These are some of the most popular methods to do it, using a point-to-point or the network using lines of transit. The standards widely used by the cities in the United States is about a 10-minute walk is considered accessible green space, which is approximately 450 meters. That's the average a citizen is willing to travel for a recreational area. Other studies have also shown that buffers up to 1,000 meters is shown fruitful in determining green space density and the accessibility of populations when using bikes, skateboards, really anything other than walking. So I decided to include a 400, 800, and 1,000 meter buffer in both of these network-based or network and Euclidean-based approach. And instead of using just residential address points or a asymmetric hotspot analysis of the population density, I'm using address points within the study area, including both residential and business properties, due to the fact that most individuals spend their time either at work or at home. So making it accessible for residents and the majority of the places that they tend to stay. So for the Euclidean distance, out of 207,000 address points, about 135,000 of those are within 400 meters of a green space, which is, it's awesome. It's pretty good. And then from 400 to 800, about 57,000. It's still not bad, but not optimal. And then about 15,000 address points outside of the 800, 1,000 plus meters of green space. Those are the main focus areas. Those are the ones that are in the most need of either additional green space or larger green space areas than what they currently have. As you see here, there's a lot of buffer area. It's the straight line distance, covers a lot of land. A more realistic approach of access for the population is a network-based approach. Seen here, it tells a largely different story on the access. About 60,000 addresses are within 400 meters of a green space. That's not very good. Whereas 71,000 and 75,000 for the 800 and 400 and 800 respectively. So then also the recommendations, taking all that data as well as the demographic data, conducting multiple analysis. These are the preliminary steps that I've done in order to try to best determine the needs area for the city. One of the first analysis or really visualizations I've looked at is the minority trends in urban green space. And number one, the denser areas or the bright pink areas are the populations of minority within a census tract. The green bubbles are the percentage of census tract area that consists of urban green space. So already there you can kind of see a lot of the darker areas have pretty small dots. They don't have a lot of green space there. Also doing a hotspot analysis or the get us order minority population by census tract really dials in where the majority of the minority population lives within Virginia Beach. Also, number 3, using Theesian polygons in order to capture the service areas for these parks. And the parks highlighted and circled in bright pink and circled in blue are the areas serving the most amount of the population. So since they're serving the most amount of the population, wanting to add more green space or larger areas to evenly distribute that. The optimized hotspot analysis using local Morans, able to get a pretty good picture using the 800 meters plus from the urban green space on the networks of the hotspot areas where a majority of these addresses are that don't have adequate access to urban green space to focus on those. Combining all those, the analysis from all of it, using optimal location analysis, one of the ArcGIS tools, finding the top 3 optimal locations to institute urban green space to serve not only the Virginia Beach community as a whole, but the minority or impoverished communities, so they have a better access to urban green space. As I mentioned, this is just a preliminary approach to looking at what's accessible and the needs. I plan on manipulating the data sets a bit and using the data points and the rasters to see what other results can be had for optimal locations. For the anticipated results, development of green space hasn't kept with the increase in the population or the increase of development for the urbanization. The rate of urban green space has not been proportional in the least bit, and that's the issue. If this keeps going down this line, there will be no urban green space left and the communities will suffer. Urban green space is a fluid concept. This is an issue with the governments and the cities until they institute proper policies to not only preserve the current green space, but to institute more and more optimized green space. This is going to be a continuous problem. The distribution of public green spaces from my current analysis has a positive correlation with income levels. In the lower income areas, as well as minority areas, there's less public green space. And in the higher income areas, there's more public green spaces. Like I said, I'm still going to conduct more analysis to see if there are any other trends. Project timeline. So I want to keep working on this. I think that there can be more done, especially looking at the 2020 census data coming out, as well as if there's going to be more Virginia land-wide coverage database, the 1 meter resolution coming out soon. I can incorporate that and double check my projections as well as incorporate more information just to make it more accurate. I would like to present somewhere around May to July timeframe, as long as everything goes on plan. And I plan on actually presenting this in Germany. I'm moving out there in a few months to my command and getting the GIS folks there to get their inputs, as well as seeing the need for the local community and seeing what kind of analysis they've done for similar efforts. Pinned any questions, please, recommendations, comments, concerns, let me know.
Any questions? Everyone's been very, very quiet today. Come on, we need some questions.
You can hear me, Jeremy?
I can, yeah.
Yeah. So you kind of maybe have mentioned this in the introduction, but are you considering comparing the changes in green spaces to the amount of urban heat island effect in the Virginia Beach area?
So, no, that's a valid point. I haven't actually found any data on that. I've seen a lot of studies that have been done on the heat islands itself, and that is information that I would like to actually incorporate. I just need to find a viable way to collect that data. A lot of the studies that I've seen when it comes to heat island, there's quite a bit of in the field data collection, and right now, especially it being winter, it's not a great time to try and go out and grab a lot of these measurements and changes. But I am looking into that to see if there is any historics that have been built for that, for the change at least.
Okay, great. Yeah, I live in New York City, and I know it's like it has a huge impact on the kind of weather that we get around here. So that'd be kind of a neat thing to include in the project, I think.
Oh, 100% agree. And that is a great point. Yeah, I will be looking for that data.
Any other questions? I think that's it then. Thank you very much, Jeremy.
Oh, thank you.
Okay, we have one final presenter. Hang in there, everybody. Monica, if you can load your presentation. Don't forget to provide feedback using the link. I've just reposted it in the chat window.
Can you see that?
Yes, I can. So whenever you're ready, Monica.
Okay, is that full screen?
Yep.
Okay.
Perfect.
All right, hi everyone. I'm Monica Chisholm, and I work for a remote sensing firm called Quantum Spatial, and the majority of the work that I do is ortho imagery production. So for my capstone, I wanted to attempt to take a product that's kind of been coming out a lot in the last few years, which is image-derived point clouds, and try to make it a better product for my organization. So I'm going to focus on making that usable for ortho photos. So first, I'm just going to give a little background on how orthos are created. So aerial imagery, it's pretty important for all GIS data and mapping. So, I mean, it's used as a backdrop for digitizing features, and it is what gives GIS context. It's a ortho-rectified imagery is taking aerial imagery and, you know, placing it geographically and removing distortion and rectifying the imagery to kind of create a final product that actually accurately represents distances on the ground. So unrectified imagery, objects don't appear the correct size. Like a closer object may appear larger or vice versa. And the orientation data and the underlying surface that goes into that production help to make this process accurate. So there are three key components to creating that product, and that's the GPS orientation data, the imagery itself, and then the surface that goes into that rectification process. The GPS and orientation data are collected from the sensor for each image. And then they go through a process called aerial triangulation, where ground control is added. And then after that, you'll take the aerial imagery and you'll kind of spread it over the surface to create orthorectified imagery. So that brings me to the part that I'm going to investigate, which is the surface that's used for that. So right here are examples of common surfaces that are used for orthoimagery. LiDAR is typically the best option. And aside from an instance where the LiDAR data might be captured along with your imagery product, I think the 3DEP program right now is probably the second best because it's the most widely available at the moment and probably the best resolution as well. LiDAR, I mean, the 3DEP program does have its own issues. It spans back to 2014, so that's a lot can happen in that time. And so if your imagery is captured in 2019, well, there's a lot that can be different in that surface. Also, there might not even be LiDAR data available for your project. The map that's visible right now is the current point cloud availability for the 3DEP program. And so if LiDAR is not available, you can obviously try to use SRTM or National Elevation Dataset data, but those are not really suitable for the type of high resolution imagery that is used today. And so no matter which surface that you go with in this scenario, you're not going to find a surface out there that's already optimized for ortho production. So that brings me to the issue that I'm going to try to resolve. So even precise surface data like LiDAR, as I mentioned, is still problematic when it's used to create orthorectified imagery. Examples of this are warping of bridges and skewing of other features that are not represented in the LiDAR data. And so that elevation does not align well with what is visible in the imagery. Also, smearing can happen when data is missing from the surface, for example. So in these images on the right, you can see examples of warping and smearing, and these are both caused by the surface that went into the creation of that ortho imagery. In general, the more accurately the surface that goes into the production represents what's visible in the imagery, the better the ortho will look. So you're probably all thinking, well, I mean, there's aerial imagery all over the place. There has to be a good way to fix this. And there are lots of ways to fix it. Unfortunately, they're all pretty manual. I think pretty much every remote sensing firm out there probably has their own way to take care of this problem and correct surface-related defects in the orthos. But there's not a whole lot of published information out there about the best way to do it. Some of the ways that you can do it are manually editing whatever surface you have. Well, LiDAR in particular is the easiest because you can actually edit the point cloud, whereas if the only surface you can download is already in like an IMG format or something like that, you're going to have to jump through a lot of hoops to perform edits to it. Another thing that you can do is to manually collect those features in stereo by collecting the Z values and adding break lines to your LiDAR surface to help define when abrupt elevation changes happen that your original LiDAR surface did not reflect. And then when all else fails, you can also use Photoshop to assist in really problematic areas. So that leads me to my project objective, which is to investigate the use of imagery-derived point clouds for orthorectification. The main goals that I want to achieve are to determine the optimal software parameters that create automated photo point clouds that are suitable for the use of ortho imagery without a lot of manual touch-up. To create ortho-rectified imagery using FODAR as the surface, and then I'm going to compare it to ortho imagery that uses LiDAR as the surface. And then finally, I would like to compare the vertical accuracy of the FODAR to the LiDAR as basically as a viable replacement for a LiDAR surface. So FODAR is a 3D surface that's derived from the imagery. You know, during this process, overlapping pixels help the software to, similar pixels, help the software to generate XYZ values for each pixel, and then the software creates a surface model. And FODAR has really come a long way in the past few years. There are many different photogrammetry softwares that are starting to incorporate this capability, but none of them work that well with the recommended FODAR settings for ortho imagery. And before FODAR, a similar process happened with manual stereo compilation, where the user would digitize the surface with the assistance of a stereo plotter, and FODAR is pretty much just a way to automate that manual procedure. So these are two methods of, well, they're two algorithms for creating FODAR that current photogrammetry softwares use. I'm going to be using Info 3D Match 3DX, and it was just released this year. It uses semi-global matching to create a 3D surface model that's derived from the imagery that you input. So SGM is designed to be more precise than its predecessor, structure from motion, which is what the previous version of this software in Info was Match T, Info Match T, and it used structure from motion, and it did not make the most amazing products for orthos. So the benefits to using SGM over structure from motion is it's newer. It can also generate up to 1 elevation point per pixel in the image. So if you have a really high quality image, you can get a really dense FODAR surface, higher density than most LiDAR that you'll find. And it also determines the Z values by considering its neighbors, and then that helps it to create a smoother appearance than previous FODAR algorithms. It can also use fewer images than previous algorithms, but even though it can use fewer, it will still use as many images as possible to try to get as much information as it can to create the best product. And then it also has really good smoothing techniques by assuming that the pixel values will change gradually as you move in any direction, and so they'll likely be close in value to their neighbors. So why would you want to create a FODAR point cloud? In terms of ortho imagery, Bare Earth LiDAR that you might download from any of the websites mentioned previously, they don't represent elevated features that are in the imagery. So in that example on the right here, the bridge deck is missing from the Bare Earth DIM, and so it creates a warp in the bridge in the ortho. And so you might say, okay, why don't you add the bridge glass to your LiDAR? Well, the one on the left shows what the bridge glass from the LiDAR looks like. It kind of creates a scalloped effect because the elevations that are present in LiDAR don't reflect the same way that that bridge is represented in the imagery. And that is because, and FODAR can help remedy this because while it will have the bridge in it, it's also going to be derived from the input imagery. So I think that it should be able to capture a bridge accurately and fix that issue. And then another reason that FODAR is beneficial is that online derived surface data from various clients means that it could have been processed in various different ways with various different resolutions, projections, and so on. And for example, it might be done in such a way that you cannot use that data. So in my work career, I've come across hydro-enforced LiDAR data, and what that is it's when the surface is dropped to the base of drainage features, essentially. And so that automatically disqualifies it from ortho use because that elevation is not represented at all in the orthos. And then another reason is you just may not even have a good quality surface for your data. If you can't find anything else and FODAR is your only option, then wouldn't it be great if you were able to generate a usable and accurate surface with that technique? So yes, it would, but FODAR, it creates a lot of problems in ortho imagery when processed as recommended. So it might make a surface that someone would look at and say, wow, I can't believe I was able to get that out of imagery. And it is really cool, but when you try to use it for orthos, if you can see this image here, the elevations cause a lot of problems in the orthos. So one of those examples is smearing. And this is because FODAR is a digital surface model. So if you kind of think of it as like, if you're getting the first return from a LiDAR data set and you're not getting the ground class. So this is why it's good for orthos in terms of bridges, but it's bad for orthos because you're going to capture the trees and you're going to create a lot of problems in any area where there's an elevated feature and the FODAR can't see the ground because it can't penetrate like LiDAR can. So through my research, I'm hoping that I'll be able to find optimal parameters within the Match 3DX software to maximize the capabilities of the SGM algorithms and then combine those results with additional filtering and thinning macros that typically get used on LiDAR data sets, but I want to try to use them to correct the issues that get created when using LiDAR or FODAR for rectification. So this is my study area. It's a location in Frankfort, Kentucky that it contains urban areas with lots of bridges, lots of water, and lots of forested areas. I chose this because of the different terrain types, and then it was also captured this year in 2019. And then it is also a really great data set to use because along with this imagery capture, there was LiDAR capture. And so I'll be able to use that recent LiDAR as a comparison tool for this project. So here's the data that I'm going to be using, the data and resources that I'll be using for this study. The imagery and LiDAR, like I said, they were both captured in 2019, and I'm going to get those from the Kentucky GeoNet. The imagery is a 1/2 foot pixel resolution, and the LiDAR is QL2 LiDAR that's processed as a 5 foot DIM. I'm going to use ArcGIS for DIM processing, QCing the data, and accuracy assessments. And then I plan to use TerraScan, which is a LiDAR editing software. And I'm going to use that to run some filtering macros on the FODAR point cloud. And then finally, I'm going to use the info software, Match 3DX and OrthoMaster, and those are for the production of the FODAR point cloud and the ortho rectification to follow. So this is my proposed research method. I'm going to be generating a FODAR point cloud in Match 3DX using pre-processed aerial imagery. So AT and the GPS data, that's already done on this data set. And I'm going to have to test various parameters within the 3DX software to see, basically I'm going to have to do a lot of trial and error to see what works best with ortho imagery. Because as I mentioned, it's really not well documented how to make it work with this process. Once a suitable set of parameters is established, and I don't think I'll get it any better, I'm going to perform an accuracy assessment using ground control checkpoints so that I have known elevations, and I'm going to compare the FODAR DIM to the LiDAR DIM. And then I'm also going to have rectified imagery that is from both the LiDAR surface and the FODAR surface. And then I'm going to perform a horizontal accuracy assessment with ground control for that data set as well. And then finally, I'm going to perform a visual QC because everybody knows that you want orthos to look beautiful. So some of the parameters that I'm going to experiment with during my testing phase are terrain type, density, precision, smoothing, and thinning. So I think I mentioned earlier that FODAR point clouds can be extremely dense. So it can be good, but it can also be bad. It can create a crunchy look if there are too many points, because you imagine that the imagery is going to try to assign each pixel to one of those points, and that could result in a funny look. So my goal is to take all these different parameters and try to find a combination that's optimal for orthos. And so in 3DX, I'm going to do the terrain type, density, precision, smoothing. And then in TerraScan, I'm definitely going to try to do thinning in TerraScan. There are also smoothing and like elevation threshold to kind of get rid of noise points settings in TerraScan, but I haven't decided if those are going to be necessary yet or not. So after I have the surface that I've decided is the best it can get, I'm going to use ground control to perform a surface accuracy assessment, a vertical assessment. So doing this, I'm going to measure the Z values against ground control points overlaid on the DIMS, and then I'm going to calculate a difference in those z-values. So that difference will be used to calculate the root mean square error for both data sets, and then I'll be able to compare them to each other. And to show this, I'll create a table that evaluates the mean variance between the two data sets. Similarly, I'm going to use the same ground control, but picture IDs for a horizontal accuracy assessment. And I'm going to perform this on the ortho rectified images that come from both the FODAR and the LiDAR data set. Both of these accuracy assessments are going to be measured according to ASPRS standards. So I'm hoping that they will both turn out as accurate with the FODAR. I'm hoping that the FODAR will turn out to be as accurate as the LiDAR. In the horizontal assessment, though, I'm going to evaluate the XY values. And then I'm going to do the same thing as I did for the vertical, where I'm going to compare the two with the root mean square error and then create a table with the difference between the two data sets. So because a huge part of ortho imagery is to have a pretty picture, I'm also going to perform a visual QC. To perform a visual QC on the orthos, a set of imagery for both the FODAR and a set of imagery for the LiDAR will be systematically QC'd. Every bit of the image will be examined, and this is a QC method that's a typical procedure for a remote sensing production. So this is how you find visual defects in the imagery. If for this study, because I'm only looking at surface problems, I'm only going to identify smears and warps, because those are the defects that would be caused by the surface. And so each defect I'll mark with a toolbar, a custom toolbar that attributes the polygon with the type of defect, and then I will export that into a table to compare. Some extra details worth mentioning are that the imagery I used in this study will be the same imagery that's used, the same imagery will go into using the FODAR, to creating the FODAR that will be used for the rectification. So this will allow those vertical features to align well with each other. The imagery that this workflow is going to be created on imagery that's from a large format digital camera, and so this isn't going to be an optimal workflow for drone imagery. And then this project will only be focusing on optimizing the FODAR. So while there is going to be a LiDAR data set compared, it's not going to be altered. And I think the reason I'm going to not focus on the LiDAR, aside from this being, from having project constraints, is that I kind of wanted to compare it to the LiDAR as it would be if you had to download it from another source. And then also the orientation parameters that went into the arrow triangulation for the project, they are an accurate step in creating ortho imagery, but because I already have an acceptable AT solution that was derived prior to the study, it's going to be used for both the LiDAR and FODAR, so I don't think that it is a factor in their comparison. Some project limitations are, like I said, the LiDAR will be used as is, and yes, there are probably parts of it that, if it were being used, could be manually edited to make it better suited for orthos, but I'm not going to focus on that in this study. I'm also only using one data set, so this workflow is only going to be tested on one ground sample distance with imagery from one type of camera, using one type of software. So I can't guarantee that this will that this workflow will be good across all data sets, but I would like to hope that it would be close. And then another limitation is that I am going to be the one QCing it, and I'm only human, so it does leave room for potential errors. And then finally, the FODAR actually has the potential to be almost the same GSD as a raster, the same GSD as the input imagery, because it can create that from create Z values from each pixel. However, because the LiDAR in this instance is QL2 and the recommended dim resolution for that is 5 foot, and my dim is 5 foot, I'm gonna have to process the FODAR down to 5 foot resolution to make them kind of apples to apples to make sure they compare the same. So my anticipated results are, I hope to have fewer warped bridges than with other surface models, because hopefully the surface will accurately reflect the imagery as captured. I hope with my processing that I can create, help to have the surface create less smears in the trees. And I'm hoping that the accuracy results kind of rival that of LiDAR. And basically overall, I hope that I've created a process for creating a reliable surface that's suitable for ortho production. And then finally, here's my project timeline. So I did mention that this data got captured this year. So right now, the imagery and the LiDAR are not fully posted on the Kentucky Geo portal. Their website does say that it will be posted by the end of 2019. So as the data becomes available, I'll continue to download it and prep it for the research. I'm hoping that by March, I'll have the full data set in hand, and I'll be able to begin different iterations of testing. And then I'm fully expecting the testing to take a long time. So my goal is to have final products that are ready for accuracy assessments by sometime in June. And then from that time through September, I'm going to finalize the accuracy assessments and create my report and a presentation for a conference. And right now I'm looking at presenting at NACIS, the North American Cartographic Information Society, in November. And that's all for my presentation. So if anyone has any questions, I am open.
Questions, anyone?
Hi, Monica. I wondered if you were considering using the full point cloud of the LiDAR to then create a digital surface model to compare, instead of just using the ground classified points for a digital elevation model.
Yeah, so I don't know if you saw or if I accurately explained the slide where the bridge surface was in that LiDAR model. That actually was a DSM, and it does not work well in orthos because it has vegetation and really inaccurate buildings when you consider the way that they are in the imagery and the way that they are in the orthos or in the LiDAR. And so I did think about it a lot, for mostly in terms of the accuracy assessment, the vertical accuracy assessment, because I was going to use both vegetated and non-vegetated points. But after speaking with some people that I work with and reading a little bit more about it, I decided that I'm only going to do the accuracy assessment on non-vegetated points, because the FODAR can't penetrate through the vegetation anyway. And so short, I guess long answer is no, I'm not going to use a DSM from the LiDAR.
Okay, thanks for clarifying that. And my follow-up question was, have you considered once you get the FODAR point cloud and you have your LiDAR point cloud about integrating them, especially if they were kind of contemporaneously collected to densify the point cloud at large?
Yeah, so one way that I actually have considered combining the two in the past is to take basically the good parts of each. And so I have done that with some success with using only bridges from the FODAR point clouds and everything else from a bare earth model. However, when you have to filter those two together or blend those two together, it also creates issues along that area. So I haven't thought of any other ways to combine them though, but that is still I definitely think that idea is worth some more effort.
Thanks.
Anyone else?
I think that might be it. Thank you very much. Thank you everybody for joining us today. Thanks all the presenters for a great presentation. We'll be back again on Monday evening where we have 5